found on item 70-5-9. It's a sample stub from the rear upper right of the shorts.
All right. So when you say rear, that means the back side of the shorts, right?
Correct.
Upper means top part closest to the waistband.
Correct.
And then on the right, it would be if you're wearing the shorts, the right side.
Correct.
All right.
Yeah, this is as being worn, the position.
Now, the next thing that we look at is going to be item 70-6. What is that item and who did it belong to?
Okay, 70-6 is a tank top shirt from Desmond Jones.
All right. And again, there were multiple swabs taken or stubs taken, right?
Correct.
And just focusing on the ones that actually gave us the positives, where were the particles located?
Okay, on item 70-6-8, a sample stub collected from the rear lower right of the shorts, or tank top shirt, I mean. So there are two particles that were consistent with primer gunshot residue found on that sample stub.
So there were two particles on the shorts, right?
Correct.
And then there's two particles on the back of the shirt, correct?
Correct.
All right. Now, moving forward and away from Desmond, but onto the next suspect person or property that was collected, we're going to be talking about Laquan Wilkerson, okay?
Okay.
And looking at this, we do have, so the first positive particles that we get, where were they located?
Okay, for sample stub 71-1, collected, item 71-1 is a left shoe from Laquan Wilkerson. And there were two particles consistent with primer gunshot residue confirmed on the sample stub collected from the exterior of the left shoe, item 71-1 of Laquan Wilkerson.
All right. And then moving over to the right shoe of Laquan Wilkerson, what was the conclusion about that?
So on the right shoe, item 71-2 of Laquan Wilkerson, there were three particles consistent with primer gunshot residue confirmed on the sample stub collected from the exterior of the right shoe, item 71-2 of Laquan Wilkerson.
And then moving on to the L sock, so the left sock of Laquan Wilkerson, did we also, was that a positive or a negative?
The left sock was a negative.
All right, so then moving on down, the right sock, was that a positive or a negative?
The right sock, item 71-4, was a negative.
All right, and then moving to the shorts, so item 71-5, we did find particles there, right?
Yes, we did. So.
Okay, so let's walk through. I'm going to shift mine real quick. Okay, so where was the first particle found?
So on the shorts, item 71-5, there was on the sample stub from the front upper left, there's one particle.
And then what about the front upper right?
So that item 71-5-2, the sample stub from the front upper right, there was one particle.
And then the next singular particle was found where?
And the next one is on item 71-5-4, sample stub from the front lower right, there's one particle.
Moving on down your report, where was the next particle found?
And the next particle is found on item 71-5-8, sample stub from the rear upper left, there's one particle.
Okay, and then the next one?
The next one is item 71-5-10, sample stub from the rear lower left, there were three particles.
And then the next positive that we had?
The next one is 71-5-11, sample stub from the rear lower right, there's one particle.
I meant to mention this earlier. Was this one of the biggest batches of GSR evidence and testing reports that you've ever worked on or put out?
To date, this is the largest report of this type I've performed.
Okay. Moving forward to the t-shirt, so item 71-6 of Laquan Wilkerson.
Okay, so on item 71-6, the t-shirt, there were, let's see, three particles consistent with primary gunshot residue confirmed on the sample stubs collected from the t-shirt, item 71-6 of Laquan Wilkerson.
Okay, where were those three particles located?
So on item 71-6-5 is a sample stub from the rear upper left. There's one particle. And item 71-6-8, sample stuff on the rear lower right, there were 2 particles.
All right. Moving on now to the left shoe. Was that a positive or a negative?
The left shoe,
Item 72-1.
that was a negative.
All right. And then moving down to the right shoe, item 72-2.
So on the right shoe, item 72-2, there were 2 particles consistent with primary gunshot residue confirmed on the sample stub collected from the exterior of the right shoe, item 72-2 of Devontae Owens.
Moving forward to a shoelace. You know what? Really quick going back. The last 2 that we just talked about, we had moved on. Those were Devontae Owens, not Laquan Wilkerson, correct?
Yes.
All right.
Item 72-1 is from Devontae Owens, and 72-2 is from Devontae Owens.
So far to summarize, Desmond Jones has a couple particles on his shirt and his shorts, right? That was the first
That's correct.
grouping.
Correct.
And then Laquan Wilkerson has more particles, but some particles on his clothing as well.
Correct.
And now we've moved to Devontae Owens, and so
Correct.
far we've got a negative on his shoe, left shoe, but a positive, which is 2 particles on his right shoe, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, so now moving to the next one, which is going to be the shoelace, item 72-3 of Devontae. Was that a positive or a negative?
That was a negative.
Okay, so then moving on down, the other shoelace, what was the result on 72-4?
So on the shoelace, item 72-4 of Devontae Owens, there was 1 particle characteristic of primary gunshot residue confirmed on the sample stub collected from the exterior of the shoelace, item 72-4 of Devontae Owens.
Okay.
And so that is a characteristic particle, 3 component.
What does that mean? What's different with that?
So the 3 component particle is one that contains the 3 elements antimony, barium, and lead, whereas the previous particles are what we call 2 component particles that contain 2 of the elements. I believe they were barium aluminums and antimony bariums.
So not as strong of a positive or a result in the ones where it's just the 2 versus the full, correct?
Right. The 2 component particles could originate from gunshot residue or from other environmental sources.
Now, we just did 72-4, right? Shoelace.
Okay, right.
So moving down to 72-5, which is a sock from Devontae Owens, positive or negative?
So the sock, item 72-5, tested negative.
Okay, and then moving right on down to the jeans, item 72-6 of Devontae Owens.
So on the jeans, item 72-6 of Devontae Owens, there were 4 particles consistent with primary gunshot residues confirmed on the sample stubs collected from the jeans, item 72-6 of Devontae Owens.
So just focusing on those 4 particles, where were they found? Where was the first one?
The first one is on item 72-6-4. It's a sample stub collected from the front lower right. There's 1 particle.
And then the next one?
The next one is on item 72-6-7. Sample stub from the inner waistband. There's 1 particle.
And then the next one?
The next one is item 72-6-10. Sample stub from the rear upper left. There's 1 particle.
And then the final 4th particle that was found on those jeans?
The final one is on item 72-6-16. Sample stub from the rear left zipper pocket. There's 1 particle.
All right. Moving down to the belt, item 72-7 of Devontae Owens. Was that a positive or a negative?
That item tested negative.
All right. And then at the bottom of page 8 of your report, what are we talking about here in item 72-8?
So 72-8 is a t-shirt from Devontae Owens.
Did we get any positives on that?
Yes, there's 1 particle characteristic of primary gunshot residue confirmed on the sample stubs collected from the t-shirt, item 72-8 of Devontae Owens. And that particle, located on item 72-8-4, it's a sample stub from the front lower right, and that's also a characteristic 3 component gunshot residue particle.
So what does the presence of that 3-component particle, what could it mean?
It would indicate that the individual either fired a firearm or handled a firearm component or object with primary gunshot residue, or wiping a firearm or firearm component or an object with primary gunshot residue on the garment.
So when it comes to clothing, if I were to fire a gun near poor Mr. Adams and Ms. Biggins, and then we took a towel and I wiped the gun off, or I wiped my hands off, those particles could transfer, correct?
Yes, they could.
And that's why we've got this wiping a firearm component or an object with the original gunshot residue on a garment.
Yes, so there can be secondary transfer where if there's primary gunshot residue particles on the outside of the weapon or on the hands of an individual, if those items come into contact with other items, you can transfer gunshot residue particles from one item to another item.
I'll pass the witness, Your Honor.
May I proceed? Briefly. Sir, the GSR testing that you do detects small particles, correct?
Yes, it does.
It cannot identify when the firearm was discharged, correct?
That is correct.
It cannot identify from which firearm these particles were ejected, correct?
That is correct.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Judge, I have no further questions for this
Thank you,
witness.
sir. You may stand down. You're free to leave the courthouse.
Thank you, Your Honor.
My next witness is outside. She's also an expert from Swifts, if we wanted to take maybe just a stretch break. Or I'm ready to call her. It's April Kendrick. Hi, good afternoon.
You do solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this cause will be the truth.
I do.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you tell the jury your full name and who you work for, please?
My name is April Kendrick. Last name is spelled Kendrick, and I work for the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences, which is also known as SWIFTS or the Dallas County Crime Lab.
Do you want a bottle of water?
Sure, yes.
Judge, may I approach?
Sure.
Thank you. And let's have this there before.
Thank you.
So we've already heard, we all call it Swifts because it's a mouthful if we don't call it Swifts, right?
Yes.
All right. What do you do and how long have you been doing it for Swifts?
I am the supervisor of the Firearm and Toolmark unit. I've been in that capacity for a little over 6 years, but I've been a firearm examiner for 12 years, and I've been with SWIFTS for almost 15 years.
What kind of education and then on-the-job training did you have that qualifies you not only to be a firearms examiner, but also the supervisor for that unit at SWIFTS?
So I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology as well as a Master of Science in Forensic Science. For my training, I participated in and successfully completed numerous written, verbal, and hands-on exercises as well as examinations. My training process took place over approximately 3 years. As a part of my training, I also attended a training school known as the National Firearm Examiners Academy that's hosted by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, also known as the ATF. That was a year-long program where I received training from experts in the field from across the country. Also, on an annual basis, I participate in proficiency tests, which those are basically tests that test me in the different analyses that I perform to see that I am able to actually successfully complete those types of tests. And I am licensed by the Texas Forensic Science Commission as a forensic analyst. For the supervisor position, I was in the firearms unit for a certain amount of time and qualified or satisfied the requirement to have a certain number of years experience as a firearm examiner to move into the supervisor position.
Have you testified on few or many occasions as a firearms expert in Dallas County?
Many occasions.
All right. Were you asked to aid and do an analysis on a case that ultimately is going to be involving complainant Shavon Randle.
Yes.
And we have lab numbers and FBI numbers, but you do a report that's under a specific number, and it's the one we'll be talking about here today, right?
Yes.
In fact, you have been part of the big group meetings and then individual meetings to develop an evidence testing plan as we've worked on this case for 2.5 years, right?
That's correct.
And tell us what your role in that big picture evidence testing is.
So my role was to examine the firearms and any of the other firearm-related evidence, which would include fired bullets, fired cartridge cases, and unfired cartridges.
Okay. And we provided you all of those things in this case to examine and do an analysis on, correct?
Yes.
Can you, before we get into this one and your report and reading through it, can you explain to us how a firearm works, right? So we've heard fired cartridge casings and bullet fragments. Can you explain to us how that works?
Yes, and I do have a demonstrative aid.
Can you
Can I
use
take
that,
that
please?
out?
Yes.
So a firearm essentially is a bunch of different tools that work together to perform a single function, which is to fire a cartridge. And this is a model of a cartridge or a single unit of ammunition. When you take a firearm, in some way you're going to be able to load it with ammunition. Probably the most common firearms that I see in casework are going to have what is known as a magazine. The magazine is where you would load individual cartridges into it, and once the magazine is loaded, you put the magazine into the firearm itself, and at that point you can, if we're talking about a semi-automatic pistol, take the slide, which is on the top of the firearm, slide it back and release it, and that makes one of the cartridges move from the top of the magazine into the chamber of the firearm. At that point, once the slide is fully forward again, the gun is ready to fire. So you would take, if there's a safety on the firearm, you could physically turn the safety off to make it ready to fire. When you pull the trigger of the firearm, it's going to release the hammer or the firing pin, and that firing pin is going to strike the primer in the base of the cartridge. This primer has a chemical mixture in it that when it's struck, it creates a spark, and that spark moves into the interior of the cartridge and lights the gunpowder that's inside on fire. As that gunpowder begins to burn, it creates pressure within this cartridge, and that pressure is looking for a place to escape. And the best way for it to do that is to push the bullet down and out the end of the barrel, and then the cartridge case would be, for a semi-automatic pistol, extracted and ejected out of the side of the firearm. And through that process, the firearm actually makes microscopic markings on this fired cartridge case and on this fired bullet.
Now, you talked about a certain type of firearm where with the magazine, the fired cartridge casing will be ejected, right?
Yes.
There's another type of firearm, a revolver, where the cartridge casing stays in the revolver, right?
That's correct.
But we don't have any of those, so we're not going to talk about that. We're going to focus on the types of guns that kick the casing over and out, okay? So on your demonstrative that you have right there, what is the cup shape? What's that called?
This is a fired cartridge case.
Okay, so once it's separated out, it's been put through a firearm and discharged. That's the fired cartridge casing, right?
Yes.
And then the top part that almost looks like an eraser, what is that?
This is the fired bullet. So it comes out of the front end or the muzzle of the firearm after the gun is fired.
Does it always look in pristine condition, the bullet?
No.
All right, why or why not?
If the bullet leaves the muzzle of the gun and doesn't strike anything, or when I do my test fires, I test fire into water. So if it went into water, it would keep its pristine or good condition. If it strikes another object like a wall or wood, a car, possibly bone, then that could cause damage to the bullet itself. It could break it into pieces, it could cause it to be deformed. So generally, in casework, sometimes I see bullets that are in really good condition that might look like this, and other times I see pieces or fragments of projectiles or bullets.
Even when you have pieces or fragments, are you still able often to do a comparison?
Yes.
Can you tell us what type of testing you can do when it's requested of you and you're presented with what I'm going to call generally as firearms evidence? So fired cartridge casings, bullets or bullet fragments, firearms themselves.
Okay.
What is the type of testing that we could even try to do?
So when I receive a firearm in a case, what I'm going to do with that is determine whether or not that firearm is mechanically functional. And what I mean by that is it able to actually fire a cartridge. I will also determine if it's safe to fire. I do that primarily to keep myself safe, because I do actually perform a minimum of 2 test fires with the gun into our water tank generally. So for the firearm, I'm determining function, or whether it's mechanically functional, and then I'll perform test fires with the gun. For bullets, which is the part that comes out of the front end or the muzzle of the firearm, I can determine the caliber of the bullet. And actually, let me backtrack a little bit. When I'm talking about a firearm, not only do I determine if it's mechanically functional and perform test fires, but I would also determine the caliber of the firearm itself, and then other class characteristics of the firearm that would put it into different groups of firearms.
Let me stop you there. So when you say that, when you say different groups, it's almost like we're talking about cars, makes, and models, right?
Yes.
But so there is a type of gun, i.e. a 9mm or 40 caliber, right? Or a shotgun.
Right.
Right? And then there are specific brands that make it, right?
Yes.
So like there are sedans, but then there are different companies that make not only sedans, but different specific types. Is that right?
Yes. So if we're talking about kind of a car comparison, when I talk about caliber, she was saying 9mm Luger, 40 Smith & Wesson caliber. That would be like saying it's a Ford or it's a Chevy. And so those are kind of the classes and the groupings that you could separate them into. But in addition to that, in addition to caliber, there is also rifling within the barrel of a firearm. And rifling is just a series of raised and lowered areas that twist either to the left or to the right. And that's determined by the manufacturer as they're creating the gun. So you might have a gun that's a 40 Smith & Wesson caliber with what we would call 6 right rifling, which means it has 6 lands and grooves that twist to the right. Or you might have a 40 caliber firearm that has 6 left rifling, which means it has 6 lands and grooves and twist to the left. So both of those are 40 caliber, that's the same class for caliber determination. But one is 6 left and one is 6 right. So that is one thing that would allow you to put those in 2 different categories. So one bullet that was fired by the 6 left firearm couldn't have been fired by the gun that has the 6 right rifling.
So it's like a Ford Escape and a Ford Explorer.
Right.
Right? And then you're able to actually do additional testing to try to almost, if we're going with the car analogy, that almost gives it a VIN number so that you can say specifically, like, it's Jen's Ford Explorer with this VIN number based off not only the rifling, but specifically what that gun does to a bullet, right?
Yes. So
Okay.
in addition to those class characteristics, when I was talking about how a firearm works, and I said that it actually leaves microscopic markings on the cartridge case and the bullet itself, those are what we call individual characteristics. And individual characteristics are within the firearm. They're created during the manufacturing process, but also over time through use and abuse of the firearm. And those will be transmitted to the firearm. Generally, those markings are kind of in a pattern, and those patterns are what I look at to determine whether or not, in my opinion, a bullet or cartridge case may have been fired by a particular firearm.
Okay. Sometimes when your testing is asked of you, you don't have the actual firearm, right?
Correct.
So is that when you do the class and characteristic testing?
I would do the class characteristic testing with or without a firearm. So I would determine class characteristics of the gun itself, but I would also determine the class characteristics of the bullet and of the cartridge case, because if the class characteristics of my bullet is different than the class characteristics of the gun, then that would be an elimination, meaning that bullet couldn't have been fired by the gun. But if my class characteristics of the bullet are the same class characteristics as the gun, that's when I would move on to compare those microscopic markings and see if that bullet could have been fired by that gun, in my opinion.
So sometimes you have firearms evidence, but no firearm, right?
Correct.
And so that's when you would try to tell us what type, like it's a 9mm Smith & Wesson.
Yes.
Right. But then when you actually have a firearm, you can do that first step, right? And then also try to see if they match or don't match, eliminate or are consistent with, right?
Yes.
And is that what we asked you to do in this case?
Yes.
We had a lot of firearms evidence, right?
We did.
So how many guns were there that you were asked to look at?
3.
Can you tell us the types of those 3 guns?
Yes.
And I'll show you a report here in a minute, but the beginning part, the inventory, it's really overwhelming because each individual piece of ammunition is logged, correct?
Yes.
All right. So walk us through the 3 different, just the type. So the type of each gun.
The type as in like brand and model, or
Yeah.
just very generic?
No, branded model, please.
Okay. I received a Bursa, which is the manufacturer. The model is a Thunder 40. It's a 40 Smith & Wesson caliber semi-automatic pistol, and the serial number is 951579. I also received a Rome arm, which is the manufacturer, model Draco. It's a 7.62 by 39 millimeter caliber semi-automatic pistol, and the serial number for that was DA-9705-16RO.
All right. And so we went through some of the firearms earlier, like physically looked at them, but that is it's not a long gun, but it is a larger weapon, correct?
It's longer or bigger than the Bursa.
Right. And then it has that curved magazine, right, or clip that goes into it.
Yes, magazine.
All right. And then the third gun that was recovered is?
It's an FN Herstal, which the FN stands for Fabrique Nationale. The model was a 5.7, and it's a 5.7 by 28 millimeter caliber semi-automatic pistol. Serial number 386308264.
You were also supplied we're not going to go through all the numbers,
Okay.
especially with all the dashes.
Right.
But you were supplied a large amount of unfired ammunition, right?
That's correct.
And then also a smaller amount of either fired cartridge casings or fired bullets, all of which were labeled or identified as coming from 2208 East Keast. And we can see it here on each of the descriptions, right?
Yes, I don't know that all of them are labeled with 2208 East Keast in my evidence listing.
All right, so let me just start then right here with, so item 41, 44, 52. These are all each labeled, either room A or 2208 East Keast, right? In this sorting.
Which number are you starting with?
All right, so the top of your evidence submitted,
Mhm.
and I'm kind of hitting it with the highlighter right here.
Yeah.
So 41, 44, 52, all of those come from East Keast.
Yeah, the only one that I see that doesn't actually list 2208 East Keast is the 41-1-2. But it does.
And that's the one that says room A near male body.
Yes.
Right? Okay. You don't actually do that recovery. The FBI did it, right?
Correct.
And then moving forward, again, we have more of the firearms evidence that was recovered from 2208 East Keast, and I just did a quick little highlight block up there on the camera for you. And then more unfired ammunition here at the bottom, correct?
Yes.
More unfired ammunition here
Yes.
on page 3, correct?
Yes.
And then basically down here at the bottom, starting with item number 79, that is it's almost an assortment of ammunition, correct?
Yes.
What does that mean when I say that, without you reading aloud each individual piece of ammo?
Right. They're just different calibers and different manufacturers. So instead of having 15 40 Smith & Wesson caliber Winchester brand, there's a variety of brands and a variety of different calibers, so an assortment.
Some of them, i.e. these pieces of ammunition that are unfired, are 40 caliber bullets though, right? Or ammunition?
Yes, 40 caliber cartridges.
Unfired cartridges?
Yes.
All right. The analysis that you did in this case, did you do functionality of each of the 3 firearms?
I did.
Did they each, did you determine each to be functional?
Yes, they were.
And how is it that you figure out that they're functional?
Essentially, I look at the firearm itself and look to make sure there aren't any cracks or abnormalities to the firearm. And then I will kind of move the moving parts of the firearm and do what I would call as dry firing without a cartridge to see if the trigger is pulling properly, if the safeties on the firearm are working properly. And then once I establish that it appears to be safe and everything appears to be working as it should without test firing it, then that's the point where I will actually perform those test fires with the gun. And if it's able to fire a cartridge, then it would be functional.
All right. For this evaluation, we grouped the evidence, right?
Yes.
So we're going to start here at the bottom of page 4 on your report, and I'll zoom in so that the jury can read along on the screen as we need to. What is the first grouping of evidence that we discussed?
It's the .40 caliber evidence.
All right. And tell us the first .40 caliber, so item 921, what was your testing and conclusion on that?
That was the Bursa 40 Smith & Wesson caliber firearm, and I determined that it was mechanically functional, and I performed test fires as well as test cycles with that firearm. And what I mean by test cycles is I loaded the gun with cartridges, but instead of pulling the trigger and firing them, I just took the slide and cycled the slide and allowed them to be extracted and ejected from the firearm without actually firing them. So when it came back out, it was an intact cartridge instead of a bullet and a cartridge case. It was still unfired, but it would have markings on it from the firearm that would indicate the cycling marks of the firearm.
And those are the lands and grooves, right?
No.
Okay, what's the difference?
Lands and grooves are going to appear on a fired bullet. So the cycling marks would be from the extractor, the ejector, and other parts within the firearm that actually function to move the cartridge within the firearm and put it in and take it out of the firearm. So those marks could be made by the firearm without actually even firing it.
Fair to me, our first witness. I'm going to show you what's already introduced into evidence last week as State 739. This is your bag and it's identified. There's your initials, your lab numbers, all the identifiers. This is your bag of test fires from the weapons, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. Now, moving on down the report, moving to the next kind of paragraph, what is it telling us here?
That next paragraph is a paragraph that is regarding some .40 caliber projectiles. Do you want me to go through the item numbers?
Yes.
Okay. That's the item numbers that you're seeing are the item numbers that SWIFT assigns to those items as they are submitted to our laboratory, so they're not going to correspond necessarily with other item numbers that you might have seen so far. So item 22, item 44-4-1-1-1, item 52-2-1-1-1, item 52-3-1-1-1, and item 52-4-1-1-1 are all .40 caliber projectiles. Item 41-1-2 was also a 40/10 millimeter caliber projectile, and they were all fired by a gun with conventional style rifling that had 6 lands and grooves with a right twist.
All right. And then based on agreement of all of those class characteristics, we started with items 22, and I have like a cheat sheet basically of what item 22 was, so we'll cover that here in just a second. But 22, and then 44-4 with all the other dashes,
Yes.
52-2, 52-3, 52-4, and 41-1-2. What were your results in those?
So those projectiles or bullets all had the same class characteristics as my gun. So that's where I took them to what I call a comparison microscope and looked at those microscopic markings to try and compare the patterns of markings to determine if they were or were not fired by the gun that I'm comparing them to. And I was able to determine that items 22 and 44-4-1-1-1, 52-2-1-1-1, 52-3-1-1-1, and 52-4-1-1-1 were all fired by the Bersa pistol, in my opinion.
All right, and the Bersa pistol is that 40 caliber, right?
Yes, it is.
And if you do all the tracking back to the beginning in the inventory coupled with the physical evidence here, we then learn that item number 22 was a bullet fragment that came from the right hip of Shavon Randle's autopsy. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then 44-4 was from room A at Keast. In the center of the carpet area was a fired bullet, correct?
Correct.
And then 52 was what from where? Instead of me reading it out loud.
It was found in the sifted material from under the floor in room A.
Okay. Was it a cartridge casing or bullet?
Oh, it was a fired bullet.
All right. And then 52-3?
Is another fired bullet that was in room A, found in sifted material from under the floor.
All right. And then 52-4?
It's also a fired bullet, and it was from the wall in room A.
All right. Now, kind of the next conclusion that we have is item 41-1-2. What was your conclusion about that?
That item was also compared to the Bersa 40 caliber pistol. My results were inconclusive on that particular item, so I couldn't say if it was fired by that firearm or if it was not fired by that firearm.
Okay, so inconclusive means exactly what it sounds like.
Yes.
It could be or it couldn't be, right? And 41-1-2 is I've got it up on the screen if you look on the left. Fingers at it.
Oh, it's a fired bullet. It was found in a towel, and the towel was in room A near the male body.
All right, and then we have what we call 1B number. That's the FBI number that they use to designate it, right?
Correct.
It would be fair to say that everyone who touches everything labels it a different number, don't they?
Yes, they do.
And then we get to trial and we do the same thing, right?
Yes.
Now, moving back to your conclusion, talking about 41-1-2, you said that it was inconclusive, but right here, where my fingers are, what were you able to tell us about it?
So, although I couldn't say whether it was or was not fired by that firearm, it does still have information that is available, such as I knew what the caliber was, and there were other class characteristics on it that allowed me to enter that information into a database that searches for other or firearms that have those same or similar class characteristics. And the list that was generated included Bersa firearms.
All right. So although you couldn't specifically say it was this Bersa 40, you can say it was from a Bersa. Is that right?
I can't say for certain that it was from a Bersa. I know that Bersas have those same class characteristics, but that doesn't mean there aren't other firearms that also have those class characteristics that just didn't come up in the list.
All right, and then when we move through your report, we then start talking about items 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 44-3, 44-5, and 44-6. Tell us what each of those items were generally.
They're fired cartridge cases,
Okay,
40 Smith & Wesson caliber.
And what was your conclusion about those?
Those also all had the same class characteristics as the 40 Smith & Wesson caliber Bersa pistol, and so I microscopically compared them to a test fire from that pistol, and I was able to determine that they were fired by the Bersa pistol, in my opinion.
Okay. And we know that we're calling it the, with emphasis on the, Bersa pistol, which is item 92-1, but it's the 40 cal Bersa that was noted as being found under the male body in room A, right?
Yes.
All right. Now moving on down, kind of your next conclusion, what do we have?
Which paragraph are you on?
Okay, so we just did
My notes, no.
Why don't you look in your notes?
Yes, it does have 20.
And the PMAG for the Draco, would it have a 30 round capacity?
Yes, it did.
Okay, thanks, pass witness.
Judge, if I may, referring to your report, so Mr. Landon was just asking you about, like if firearms evidence, specifically bullets, were recovered from the crime scene later,
Yes.
if that .40 caliber could have shot them, right?
I think I took him to be asking that regardless of time, I could still determine if it was fired by a particular gun, but that my analysis doesn't tell me anything about the timeline of when it was fired.
All right, but the items themselves and the officers who recovered them do tell you about the timeline, right?
In general, it's on the submission paperwork,
Okay.
usually.
In this one, we don't need to dig through the submission paperwork, but found in sifted material from under the floor is for item 52.2 and then 52.3 as well, right?
Yes,
And then also from the wall in room A for 52.4, correct?
correct.
And let me walk you through hypothetically. So if there were some fired cartridge casings that you matched up to a .40 caliber,
Okay,
okay, and that came from a search on day one, okay,
yes,
and then that .40 caliber is removed from the scene and secured, it's never back out in the public, okay?
Right.
And then 6 weeks later, there's additional firearms evidence recovered.
okay,
If it tricks back to that same .40 caliber, it would mean that it was shot before the .40 caliber was taken and secured, is that right?
that's correct.
All right, that was kind of convoluted, but your results are that all the .40 caliber evidence, except for that one that was unsuitable, came back to that burst of .40, right?
Except for the one that was inconclusive, and then there were 2 that were unsuitable, yes.
Yes. Pass the witness, Sean.
2 questions. You cannot testify where those shell casings were discharged, can you?
No,
And you cannot testify when, with one proviso, that it happened before that firearm came into your custody.
that's correct.
Now, I'll pass witness, thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. You may stand down. You're free to leave the courthouse.
Thank you.
Members of the jury, let's take a break. It's 2:30. We'll be back in the jury room at 2:45.
All rise.
Check. Give me that report. Thank you. We'll start on these.
Well, in that case.
Hey folks, I'm sorry about the confusion out there. We had an issue in the courtroom, and out of an abundance of caution, we took the video stream down, and then we decided that we would put the audio back up. So I'm sorry about that. We've had this bit of technical issues that we've had to deal with, but obviously we always want to make sure that we handle things correctly. Again, I'm joined by Meredith Behgooy.
Behgooy.
I am gonna.
You've said it different every single
can,
time.
I can completely butcher her name many ways. Well, you know, we just heard from this firearms examiner, and folks, during the point when you guys weren't able to hear or C. It really wasn't. It was not exactly titillating.
No,
so they didn't really miss
there was
anything.
nothing to see. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty dry stuff. But this is the kind of stuff they have to do, though.
Yes, it is, because they have to be able to link the bullets, the casings, all of the firearms evidence to a specific gun, or eliminate it from being fired from a specific gun. So although it is dry, there's very little you can do to dress it up, I guess.
And so there were 40 caliber projectiles. I wrote down that there was one that they found with Shavon Randle that matched one of these guns.
Okay.
And I'm not clear on which gun that was, whether that was the
Right.
gun in Michael Titus's hand or if it was one of the other guns that they found. There was a gun that was in the hotel room, and there was a couple of guns in that car. So it's a little bit, a lot of what will happen here, and Meredith, you can talk about this, is at some point they're going to presumably put up a lead investigator who's going to tie nice little bows on all this stuff.
Yes.
And kind of explain to us what all this means.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, you can't ask the firearms examiner where this bullet came from, because she doesn't know. She got the bullet
She testifies
when
to
she
her
was
piece
in the
of it.
lab, so she can't testify to stuff that she doesn't know. So you do put up your lead detective at the end to tie together all these pieces and say, okay, I've got this cartridge casing, I've got this bullet, and I've got this gun, and do they all match? And then they, wrap it up with a bow, explain everything, hopefully, so that the jury can understand it.
And we also heard from the guy who was speaking about firearms particles.
The gunshot residue testimony. Yes.
What do you think about that?
I thought it was helpful for the state. Definitely, you have gunshot residue on Desmond Jones. Now it is on the back of his shorts, and what was it? In the inner waistband, there was one particle, and there's one particle on the back of his upper right shorts. So that's not a lot of gunshot residue, but you can't get it any other way. It's got to be from a fired gun. Now, what the defense hasn't said, but I'm sure they'll argue, is that you can rub up against someone who's got gunshot residue on themselves. If you've ever been to a gun range, it's everywhere. It gets everywhere. It can transfer so many different ways. So helpful, yes. Definitive, no. And then comparing it to what the other people have on them, I worry that we're getting into who has the most gunshot residue, meaning who is the most culpable, which is not, you can't.
It's not the way it works,
That's
right?
not the way it works, no.
Were you, is this kind of typical? Like, today has felt like pretty, it's not the exciting, yesterday's testimony was when we had Ladoris Randle on the stand. That was Shavon's cousin, talking about, getting these phone calls. That was really compelling testimony, even though she was fairly dry in her delivery of it. It was very compelling. But today it's felt very.
Eyewitness testimony is always better. To the listener, it's very compelling, it's very engaging and emotional. And so what we have now is we've got to put in all of the physical evidence, and it is a circumstantial case. That's what the prosecutor was saying. You're putting the pieces of the puzzle together, but you're putting in physical pieces of evidence, and there's a certain way to do it. And that's what the prosecutor's doing, is laying all these foundations to put everything in and get it all into evidence. And it is very tedious and time consuming, and that's why Law and Order doesn't show any of this part.
Right, because it's not the exciting stuff.
No, it's not exciting.
Well, I can see folks are still kind of asking about what happened in the courtroom. Look, I'm not going to try to get into all the details of it, but we were not, ordered to take a trial feed down or anything like that. But what we did was, again, out of an abundance of caution, the right to it's not a right to live stream a trial. It's a privilege, and part of why we do this is we want people to see kind of how the criminal justice system works, how the sausage is made, so to speak, and be able to explain to folks what's happening and why it's happening. But out of an abundance of caution, we did cut the trial feed for a period, and then you heard me say, please, can we get our folks audio? And so that's what we did. We went back to audio, and then I don't know if this situation will be solved when they get back from the break, but either way, we'll have audio of what's happening after the break, and then hopefully the other issue will have worked itself out. But this is now the third trial that I've done this with. We did this with the Amber Geiger trial, And I think that a lot of people get a lot out of this, and we also did it some with the Christopher Hess trial. So
I do too. I think it's really important for people to see what goes on at their criminal courthouse every single day. These are elected officials. This is their elected DA. This is what we do day in and day out. And I think a great portion of the community is unaware that it's going on, but you can see by the viewership that, you know, people really enjoy watching it and knowing what's going on, and they're asking great questions.
They are, and so I did write down a few questions that folks had. Okay, let me answer. So Candace M wants to know. So there won't be a replay of the stream. So the stream that was it's currently listed as private, but we will get it back up eventually. If we can. There's some things are in motion, as you can imagine, that I don't have any control over. So we're just trying to do the right thing and make sure that everything is done properly. So that's to be determined at this point. But somebody had posted earlier, and they were asking about why were we talking about the gunshot residue.
Oh,
let's talk about why. I mean,
Why?
Why do we have to hear about gunshot residue?
Gunshot residue is like a staple of any gun case where a firearm's been fired. Immediately, the victim that goes in for an autopsy, they immediately bag the hands and protect the hands. That's the first test they do. Is they do a little dab on the back of the hands to see if there's any gunshot residue, to see if they were in proximity to a firearm, or if they have more gunshot residue, they could have actually fired a firearm in self-defense or whatever. And so the gunshot residue testing has been going on for a very, very long time, and it just shows that you were somewhere near a firearm when it went off.
And
there's
again, it's
no
not
other way.
definitive. It's not saying aha. It's not the
No.
CSI moment.
Right, but if you're around gunshot residue and then you have other evidence tying you to a crime scene where a gun was fired, it is a very big piece of evidence, I would say.
Now, somebody also was asking about why it is that Desmond Jones, that Michael Titus's death is not a part of this. Okay, so let me give a little bit of background. So there are 4 people that were indicted for engaging in organized crime: Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, Laquan Wilkerson, and
Darius Fields.
Darius Fields. See, my brain's not working here. And so they were all charged with this umbrella indictment. And in the original indictment, it did list Michael Titus. But when this...
As a co-conspirator or as a
Well,
victim?
the original indictment, which I've got right here, listed Michael Titus's death. But as this was going to trial, I don't know why this was done, but Michael Titus was struck out of the indictment. And they also struck the thing about, the indictment originally said that Desmond Jones was a member of a criminal street gang. Why do you think they would have struck those things?
Well, to be a member of a criminal street gang, there's actually a database of criminal street gangs, and it's pretty extensive, and it changes and it updates very regularly all the time. So that is a big moving target, and it sometimes can be very difficult because you can't just walk up to somebody and say, hey, are you in this gang? Are you in the Blue Bonnet gang? No one's going to be like, yeah, I am. So you have to prove, that would be something the state would have,
They had to prove it up.
Yeah, and you can imagine how hard that is when you're definitely not going to get somebody to take the witness stand and say that, I'm assuming, to just self-admit. So that's something that they don't have to prove. They can prove, but if they
It's not
strike it,
necessary.
now they don't have to worry about it. They can move on to other things in the indictment.
Why strike Michael Titus?
Why strike Michael Titus? I mean, same thing. They don't want to have to prove that he was engaged in the murder of Michael Titus. Why they decided to do that, I have no idea, but they felt like they did not have the evidence, or they couldn't put forth enough evidence to make that charge. So instead of holding themselves to that burden, strike it out, because they've got plenty of other, they've got the kidnapping of Shavon Randle, they've got the murder of Shavon Randle, he's engaged in committing that, and so they don't need Michael Titus.
When you look at the kidnapping, is that what gets you there?
Mm-hmm. What gets you where?
I mean, in other words, is that what gets you to the murder? Because he gave statements where he said that he was the lookout and they thought they were going to kidnap LaDoris Randle, who was her cousin.
Yes.
But they actually kidnapped
Shavon.
Is that what
Right.
gets you there?
Well, now, when you think about, and I just saw Better Call Saul, and so that's kind of in my mind, like, you know, when you're kidnapping someone for a drug debt,
Something bad might happen.
something bad might happen. Yeah, that person may not make it. And so, yeah, I think he knew or should have known is kind of the standard we look at is, did you know? Because people will say, well, I had no idea they were going to do that. But should you have known that this is a high-level drug operation? These are not people you want to mess with. And we're down to
And if-
kidnapping the man's girlfriend or now niece or whatever. I mean, that is a very dangerous proposition right there. So yeah, you know, he could be found guilty.
Okay, so Mocha Love, 98, has a question. She wants to know if it's determined in court that he was around when the gun was shot, can the attorney ask the court to change the charges or request another charge?
No, it's too late to change the charge at this point. Jeopardy is set in. The charge is the charge. Now, you could request lesser included offenses, but I don't know at this point that we're there. I mean, you could always ask for a lesser included.
What would be a lesser included here?
Aggravated assault? I mean, it doesn't really fit.
Aggravated
because
kidnapping?
Aggravated
But even then,
kidnapping-
those are first degrees, right?
yeah.
It doesn't feel very lesser included. I mean,
Aggravated assault is a second degree.
Oh,
But
it's a second
aggravated
degree.
kidnapping would, I don't even know if it is a lesser. I mean, yeah, it is. It's in there, so it could be a lesser. But it has to be contained within this charge. It can't be something that comes in from outside just because the evidence raised it. It has to be within the indictment that they've charged him with right now as they read it to the jury. So we are limited to that document and
So-
any lesser included offenses. And the state certainly would not be asking for a lesser. It would be the defense that would be asking for the lesser.
Well, and in some ways, you know, of course, we don't know what evidence they have in the other cases, but presumably this is what they would have in the others, right?
Right.
I mean, because since we're doing and engaging in organized crime, you're going
I
to...
think you'd see it all.
Right. So presumably whatever we'd see in this trial, we would see in a Devontae Owens trial.
Maybe
or-
their statements too. Instead of his statement, you'd be seeing their statement as well.
And I don't know that they ever gave statements. You know, I mean,
So-
he gave a lot of statements. He did
gave-
a lot. He
he
did a
gave
lot of
enough for
talking.
everybody.
This is probably, and I've told every legal expert I've had on, we've all talked about the fact that this is exactly what you would advise your client not to do. So somebody else wanted to know, will we see evidence if Mike Titus had gun residue on his hands, or will that come out in another trial?
That's a very good question. I don't know if we were going to see that, we should have seen it when the gunshot residue expert was testifying, and we didn't hear any of that. So, like I said, it is a normal course of business for the medical examiner to test for gunshot residue on everyone who comes in through with an autopsy. They would have tested Mike Titus. I can't imagine a reason why they would not have.
Well, especially since
He's got a gun in his hand too. I mean,
right. Of course, the FBI agent said she thought it was staged,
Sure.
which makes sense
Very
given
well
what we
maybe.
know of what Desmond says about what happened. And again, I take what Desmond says with a little bit of grain of salt here. You know, his contention is that that Michael Titus is the one that hurt Shavon Randle.
clearly that was what they were hoping the police would think if they set his body there with a gun in his hand. That's what they were hoping the story would be.
Okay, so Deborah Bell wants to know, what has Kendall Perkins been charged with? Kendall Perkins is facing an aggravated robbery charge. So again, I feel like I'm belaboring this, but Kendall Perkins is the boyfriend of Ladoris Randle, who was Shavon's cousin. And he, according to testimony, went to this Motel 6 room and hijacked 100 pounds of pot, which is worth a lot of money. And
$250,000.
it's not pocket change, no. And which sets in motion this string of events that leads to this horrible situation. Hold on, somebody emailed me wanting to. I'll go look. I'll go read what they're asking. So, okay.
And he's been charged with.
April Moore says it's Texas and they should have charged all of them with both homicides. Well, you know, I think that, let's talk a little bit about this, that there's a misnomer about this charge because people are keying in on the fact that, well, this is not a murder charge.
This is Texas. We like our murder charge. We want our murder charge.
But he is charged with murder.
He is.
I mean,
Yes.
it's called engaging with organized crime.
It's
but
kind of like when you have someone charged with manufacturing or delivery or possession with intent to deliver just because they have a large quantity of drugs on them. It doesn't mean they're actually going out and manufacturing it. It doesn't actually mean they're delivering it. It's just the statute that you fall under. So the state has opted to prosecute Desmond Jones under this statute of engaging in organized criminal activity, which makes it a lot easier for the state to prosecute you if you are part of a criminal conspiracy. And that's where we are. So it's a conspiracy to commit murder, basically.
Right, and so if the indictment was for murder, then you couldn't bring in like all this stuff we heard about what was found in Darius Fields' motel room where he's caught with LaPortia Polly at this Best Western out in Irving. Presumably, we wouldn't hear any of that.
No. It
wouldn't be relevant.
It would
probably.
all be qualified under extraneous offenses. So if you have a straight murder charge, one person killing another person, then anything other than evidence tending to show this person killed the other person is going to be called extraneous evidence, and there's going to be a big legal battle to get any of it in. But when you put it under engaging in organized criminal activity, since the state has to prove there was criminal activity, they have to prove how many actors, they have to prove all these things, then it all comes in easily and cleanly, and it's still going to be a first-degree murder charge. In the end, you get up to 99 years or life in prison from a jury. So it's just the way it's worded, it makes it much easier for the state to prosecute.
Okay, so Julie M. is asking how many of these guys have already been convicted. Well, currently no one has been convicted in Shavon or Michael Titus's deaths. Right now, Darius Fields is serving 18 years in prison, in federal prison, on gun charges, and he's still facing that engaging in organized crime related to this situation. And LaPortia Polly was the woman that was at the Motel 6 when the drugs are taken. She is serving 4 years in federal prison related to gun charges for basically providing guns to this drug ring. Mm-hmm. And let's see, but she's not charged in this offense. Do you think we might hear from LaPortia Polly?
LaPortia Polly? No, I don't think so. If I had to guess, I would say no.
I'd like to hear from LaPortia Polly.
We'd all like
I mean,
to
I
hear.
feel like I'd like to hear from Kendall Perkins.
We'd like to hear from everybody, yeah.
Nothing against our firearms examiner
No.
or our ballistics people.
They do
but
good work.
But I would like them to summarize it and do it nice and quickly, because it's hard for, when they start talking in these exhibit numbers, it's hard to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And how hard is it for a jury to follow?
I know, especially after lunch.
Exactly.
Impossible.
Exactly. And Let 'em Hang Dang, gotta love these YouTube handles, is asking, is it likely that all charges will be dropped?
All charges?
About as likely as the tooth fairy is to
I
exist.
bet Desmond Jones hopes that the charges will be dropped.
Yes, I don't see that happening. I think that's pretty unlikely. Okay, so Nick, our erstwhile web guy that if some of you who've been hanging around watching trials have heard me talk about, is telling me that court is back in session, but we don't have audio yet. We don't, I mean, I would love to play the audio for you, but we don't have the audio to even post. But when we get it, we will absolutely, have it to where you guys can hear it. Okay, so when Erica M says, when did Ladoris talk to the coworker? Was it before or after the kidnapping? Okay, so y'all are going to go into my memory banks. So Ladoris testified that she initially gets approached by a coworker before the kidnapping, and the coworker is asking her about KP, and I forget exactly what she says, but she does get approached, obviously gets some wind that these folks are looking for KP and they're upset. And then after Shavon is kidnapped, she starts getting calls from a blocked number, and then a call comes from Shavon's phone, and basically threats that you need to return the drugs, and and she acknowledged on the stand that she didn't tell the authorities everything she knew. And I said this, you know, multiple times, but I just have to wonder.
If she had said something earlier,
You know,
would Shavon be alive today? I think that's the question that everybody's been kind of commenting about. And I saw the comments where they said Ladoris had a very flat affect, did not seem remorseful, looked like she was 10 toes down for her man. I think everyone's got that impression of her.
Well, and I was struck, and you know, you never know why somebody testifies. You never know why somebody testifies the way they do, or why they're not showing emotion. I mean, I was struck by her. It felt not. It didn't. I didn't sense any emotion. But again, that, you know, people react. You know, and you know this.
People react very differently under stress, and they can be under medication. And
I mean, I tend to. I mean, this is terrible to say, but when I'm under stress, I tend to become kind of a smarty pants, right? I mean, that's just
You're animated.
I'm animated, and I you know, that's just the way I tend to handle stress. I'm not one to or I get mad. It just depends on what's happening. But you can't necessarily take someone's demeanor to mean how they're feeling.
No.
Right. Do you see that sometimes where when you're with your defendants,
Absolutely,
or when you're a prosecutor?
Or with kid victims, you know, they'll shut down on you, and adults will do that too. They'll shut down on you. It's just too much for them to handle. It's too traumatic, too scary. So I do think that could be another explanation for why she appeared the way that she did. And also, she presumably has a lawyer or legal representation to advise her about what she can and can't say on the stand to avoid any potential criminal charges.
Well, exactly. And you're right. And her testimony could have, I don't know if practiced is the right word, but you go over in your mind over and over what you're going to say. I guess the more you do that, it can become, I don't know if rote is the right word,
We
but
tell our witnesses not to do that because it does come across sometimes as rehearsed or fake sounding, and you don't want that in a criminal case.
it didn't feel fake to me. It just felt, I guess I wanted some emotion. I guess I was waiting for her to, you know, break down and cry, because again,
That would be appropriate.
they're coming to kidnap her.
Mm-hmm. It could have been her.
It could have been her, and
It could
that
have
was,
been her
you
in
know,
that house.
and that's what's, you know, when you think about that's just terrifying. Okay, so Sabrina Monet, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that because I am terrible with names, wants to know, is Desmond going to take the stand? That's the
I saw that. That's the $1 million question that we always want to know in every case is the defendant going to take the stand? And you know.
We got sound? So I can stop talking?
You can finish your question and then we'll...
Oh, okay, folks. Well,
Okay.
all right. Well, let's finish this question and then listen.
Well, I think they know the answer, but the answer is that no one knows. It's up to him. His attorney will tell him whether he should or not, but it's ultimately his decision. And I think he's already kind of testified through his own statements. So it's just going to come down to when the state closes its evidence, do they think it's a good idea or not?
Okay, so let's listen to what's going on in the courtroom. Does anybody know who's on the stand? Okay, well, we're going to just start listening, folks, and we'll figure it out.
Machine and makes multiple copies of the DNA. And then we finally put it onto another instrument that then generates the DNA profile. And what we're trying to do is obtain DNA profiles from items of evidence. And once we generate those DNA profiles, if we generate a profile, we then want to make a comparison to any known individuals we have. And we see if they can be included to that DNA profile or if they're excluded to that DNA profile. Anytime we make an inclusion of an individual to a DNA profile, we then want to give a statistical weight to that inclusion to see how significant of an inclusion that is. And typically the type of statistic we do, it's called a random match probability. That's very simply asking the question, if I was to take a randomly selected individual, what would be the probability that they could have contributed or been the source of that DNA profile? Then once we make all of our comparisons, we then generate the reports.
Okay. So there wasn't like an order of the evidence where we start with piece 1, piece 2, piece 3. It really is done in, when you look at the reporting out, almost in, some are in batches, but it's in small groupings, right?
Yes, it was in groupings.
So you and I have prepped to try to make this as easy and clean as possible. And the easiest way is to go chronologically. And when I say that, I mean when your reports got released.
Yes.
Okay. So the first one that I want to talk to you about is going to be State's Exhibit number 532, which is your report dated and filed June 29th, 2018.
Yes.
Okay.
What number is that again?
So it's already in 532. And then I'm also going to introduce State's Exhibit 565. Mr. Fishburne.
No objection.
Okay.
Admitted.
So you have a report, right?
Yes.
And then there's the file date up at the top. The one that we're going to use here in court, I went through and highlighted and color coded, right?
Yes.
And you've seen it.
Yes.
You weren't out there at the scene, so you don't know where the swabs were taken from, right?
That's correct.
And the only identifiers in this report are this 1B number for a large amount of the evidence. Some do have better descriptions, but a lot of them just have this 1B number, right?
That's correct.
And that does not help us know where it came from in this mountain of stuff in the well, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so let me pull, I've got one more thing. So we're gonna keep this key up here to help us follow along with the color coding, okay? So the first report that you have that was dated filed and dated June 29th, 2018. The very first thing that you do in your report is log what?
The very first part of the report is a listing of all the samples that will be on this report.
All right.
All the samples that were analyzed for DNA.
So here on the very first page, we only have blue and yellow for that first substantial swab. So that's Keast and the white Ford, right?
That's green.
I'm so sorry. Blue and yellow would be suspect's property and then the white Ford. Nope.
There's
I did
two
it wrong
blues.
again. Too much science today.
Sorry.
All right. Luckily, I have it written down and we don't have to refer to colors ever again as we move forward. There are some colors here on these pages, right?
That's correct.
Let's just make it basic, right? Keep it simple. Here on page 2, and then again also on page 3, we continue with the inventory.
Yes.
The one thing that I do want to draw your attention to is here, which I have not actually circled or highlighted. Tell us what a buccal swab is.
So a buccal swab is a way to get a person's DNA standard. Very simply, it's a Q-tip, swab the inside of a person's cheek cells, and then that's where we get their DNA profile from.
Okay. And who did we have buccals from in this case?
There was a buccal swab from Laquan Wilkerson,
Okay.
Desmond Jones,
Okay.
Devontae Owens,
Okay.
LaPortia Polly, and Darius Fields.
All right. And then we also had a known sample right here. So it's not a buccal, but it says an autopsy blood standard. What is that?
That would be a standard that the medical examiner would have collected of Michael Titus.
All right. And then up at the very beginning, which I skipped, we have the same thing from Shavon Randle, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Moving forward through your report, did you do a DNA analysis on that first batch? So all those items that were listed in pages 1 through 3 of State's Exhibit 565.
Yes.
And what is it that you're looking for in this first, so table 1 here in the results and conclusions? We're gonna go back to colors here in a minute when we get into the numbers.
So what this table is describing is that it lists out every sample that was tested, and then when you go over, so this would be the item number, this second column would be the descriptions of what it was, the next one is the description of the profile. And this is asking if I believe that there was a full DNA profile there, if there was possibly incomplete, so there may or may not have been a full profile, or if it was incomplete. So by looking at the profile, I knew that information was missing. The next column, this column, says numbers of contributors. As I said before, we get half of our DNA from our mothers, half of our DNA from our fathers. So at any one area we're looking at, one person could have 2 genetic markers. When we look at these profiles, if at these areas there's 4 or 5 or there's multiple genetic markers, that lets us know more than one person contributed that DNA profile. So going down this column is how many people contributed to the DNA profile. And then finally, it's the profile category. We can break those down into, if it's one person, that would be considered a single source profile. And then we have mixtures. For mixtures, we can determine that they're simple mixtures. That just means all I can say about it is that it's a mixture of individuals.
So hold on, let me stop you. So when you say a mixture of individuals, that could mean 2 people, 3 people, 12 people. It's just a mixture.
Right, it's just a mixture, and I can't say anything else about it.
All right, and then tell me about like the next sample or example that we might see here in that last column.
That major minor, what that means is that it's a mixture, so there's more than one contributor, but when I look at that mixture of DNA, I can see that one person contributed more of a profile than another. So in that case, the person that contributed more would be the major contributor, and the person who would be, or anybody left over, would be in that minor contribution.
All right, and then the other thing that we haven't really seen an example of until we get to the next page, what does it mean whenever it just says no DNA profile obtained?
It means that no DNA profile was obtained from those samples.
Okay. Does it mean that no DNA exists in that sample?
It means that from that sample that was taken, there was not any detectable DNA. It could be something that, you see somebody touch something and you still may or may not get a DNA profile. So just because you didn't get one, there was just not enough detectable DNA.
Now, in addition, on your report, you then have a section called disposition of evidence that we really don't need to talk about. It doesn't really give us evidentiary value. And then Appendix 1 is the actual table that you're talking about in regards to genetic markers, right?
Yes.
And we are not going to go into this. We're going to focus on Appendix 2, right? Isn't that what we like to talk about?
Yes.
All right, because that's really where the good conclusions are. And when I say good, I mean the ones that provide us information, all right? So starting here with Appendix 2, the first 4 rows that we have, those were from basically the autopsy kit from the medical examiner, right?
That's correct.
So we don't have any information on those that comes back to any of our suspects. It's just Shavon.
That's correct.
So moving down here, so it's, are we calling it aqua? Blue. The cross tour is what these next 4 columns go to. Tell me about the results. Let's start specifically with the first one. So 26.1.1.1. What does this mean when it says included in these 5 columns?
Okay, so that was a mixture of 4 individuals, and Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Devontae Owens, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus were all included as being potential contributors to that mixture. Then the next thing you see in that column says 94 and 100. So the statistic for how significant of that inclusion is 94 and 100. So for every 100 people, you would expect 94 people could be included.
Would it be fair for me to characterize that as not statistically a great number?
Yes, it's fairly low.
In other reports, we will see something like 1 in 10 trillion. That has a lot more value for all of us, but for you too as a DNA expert, right?
It's a much stronger statistic, yes.
All right. That was the science way of saying it, right? All right. So moving on, the next one that we have that comes up with a number, albeit low, is going to be item 26.2.1.1. So another DNA swab from the cross tour. Whose DNA, albeit a low number, do we have?
Laquan Wilkerson was included as being a potential contributor with a statistical weight of 1 in 29.
All right, and then the next one, 26.3.1.1.
Michael Titus was included as being a potential contributor to that mixture with a statistical weight of 1 in 3.
And then the next one, we have all the people across the board, but again with that really low number, right?
Yes.
What does that tell you?
That means that they were included, not excluded, but with a statistic that for every 100 people, 94 people would also potentially be included.
When you have mixtures, especially mixtures of 4 or more people, what happens to the statistics generally?
Generally, the more people or the more mixture, or more number of contributors, your statistics become smaller.
Moving on down, so here to the yellow where we've got the white Ford. Can you tell me, let's start with the first one, where we had it across all 7 columns again.
So again, this was a mixture of 4 individuals. All of the people compared were included with a statistical weight of 98 and 100.
All right, and moving on down to 26.6.
This again was a mixture of 4 individuals. Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, and Michael Titus were all included with a statistical weight of 1 and 3.
All right, and then the next row moving down.
Again, this was a mixture of 4 individuals, and everybody compared was included with a statistic of 98 and 100.
Would you state for the record the names of the people, please?
Oh, yes. Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, LaPortia Polly, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus.
And so the names of each of those people are across at the top of the column, right?
Yes.
So anytime we see included with a number, that's referring to the person at the top of the column, correct?
That's correct.
And then when we have an excluded, again, that's referring to this person at the top of the column, right?
Yes.
So generally moving down to the final 2, we have weak numbers hitting on some suspects, but not all, right?
That's correct.
Moving to the next page, so this is going to be all yellow, so all the white Ford. Up at the very top, so this is in the white Ford, it's a DNA swab, right? Starting with that first column, tell me what we see and what's important.
That was a mixture of 3 individuals. This could be determined to be a major contribution and a minor contribution. There was 1 single source in the major contribution that matched the DNA profile of Desmond Jones.
What was our statistics on that?
The significant statistic is less than 1 in 10 trillion. To put that a little easier, there's about 7.9 billion people on this earth. You would need roughly about the population of 1,000 Earths, and you would expect to find that DNA profile 1 time. And in that minor contribution, Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Devontae Owens, LaPortia Polly, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus were all excluded.
Right, and I'm actually going to jump down to 26.14.1.1 because we have the exact same result in this one as well, correct?
Yes, that was a mixture of 2 individuals. Again, it was a major and a minor. Desmond Jones was included as being a contributor to that major contribution, and Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Devontae Owens, LaPortia Polly, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus were all excluded.
Now, going back up to the second column, what are our results from that swab 26.11.1.1?
That was a mixture of 3 individuals. Desmond Jones was included as being a potential contributor to that mixture with a statistical weight of 1 and 2.
Now, the next 2 columns have something that we haven't seen before. Tell us what the results were and what the NI means. Next 2 rows, I'm sorry, not columns.
Yes. Those next 2 columns that have the NI, that means not interpreted, they were both mixtures of 4 individuals, but due to the sample and what they were seeing, there was no way to give a statistical weight to that. And when that occurs, we will not interpret it, and we will just simply put NI.
All right, and then the next one that we have not yet discussed is going to be 26.15.1.1. What were the results on this DNA swab from the white Ford?
It was a mixture of 3 individuals. Desmond Jones was included as being a potential contributor to that mixture with a statistical weight of 1 in 318.
Not a great number, right?
It's not a...
10 trillion.
That's correct. It's not a high number.
But it certainly is a higher number than the 98 and 100 or 94 and 100, correct?
Yes, that is a higher number.
All right, so moving down the next one, and then this is the first time that we're seeing, so can you explain to us what inconclusive means in reference to 27.1.1.1?
One more time.
27.1.1.1.
This is a sample that was a mixture of 5 individuals. we don't do stats for greater than that amount of people. So the EPO on that first column stands for exclusionary purposes only. So based on, we would either say that it was inconclusive or we could exclude a person. And in this case, all individuals, Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, LaPortia Polly, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus all got an inconclusive to that mixture.
All right, let's talk about the next row and what were the results here.
That was a mixture of 3 individuals: Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, LaPortia Polly, and Michael Titus were all included as being potential contributors with a statistical weight of 82 and 100.
Moving on to the next one, tell us what the results were in item 27.3.1.1.
That was a mixture of 4 individuals: Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, and Michael Titus were all included as being potential contributors with a statistical weight of 1 and 3.
And again, statistically, that is not a great number, correct?
Correct. For every 3 people, you would expect 1 person would be included.
And you even said that this was a mixture of 4 people, right?
Yes.
But we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are potentially included under that 1 and 3 stat. So it shows us it's really not that helpful for our purposes, right?
Yes.
Okay. There's 5 people in it, but we know there's really only 4.
Correct.
All right. Now moving on to the next 2. Generally, we have so everyone's included in the next one, and then almost everyone except for Darius is included in the 27.5, but again, not strong stats, right?
That's correct.
And I'm going to skip the last 2 because they are either inconclusive or excluded and have no value. So moving here now to page 22 of your first report. Talk to me about the first swab. Again, yellow, so white forward.
So again, this was a mixture of 4 contributors: Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus were all included with a statistical weight of 55 and 100.
And then the next one, everyone is excluded except for Michael Titus. And what was the statistics on this?
He was included with a statistical weight of 1 and 2.
And then the final white forward swab just for this report, but not collectively. What do we have here for 27.10?
This was a mixture of 4 contributors: Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, LaPortia Polly, and Michael Titus were all included as being potential contributors with a statistical weight of 96 and 100.
Now, the next grouping that we have here is all green, which I've used to mark as DNA that was collected or swabs that were collected from 2208 East. Walking through, so the first 2, we have the same results, which are what?
Those were both single source profiles that matched the DNA profile of Michael Titus. The statistic for both of those was that less than 1 in 10 trillion.
And then the next 4, and then also the bottom 2 here on page 22, we have the same results. So tell us what those are.
Those were also single source profiles that matched the DNA profile of Shavon Randle, and the statistical weight for that was that less than 1 in 10 trillion.
All right. And then the only other one that has value we haven't spoken of is 27.18.1.1. What was the result in this?
That was a single source profile that matched the DNA profile of Michael Titus with that statistic of less than 1 in 10 trillion.
All right. Now moving to the next page. So we're gonna have, I started green, but it should be the aqua. So it's the cross tour and the Best Western, right? According to my color coding.
Yes.
So starting first with the Best Western, the first 3 rows have no evidentiary value, but the last one, what does this mean, the excluded and inconclusives, the comment EPO?
So that EPO is what I talked about before that. It's a mixture, It's going to be determined for exclusionary purposes only. So in this case, Shavon Randle and LaPortia Polly were excluded as being potential contributors to that sample, and Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus were all inconclusive.
And then moving down, so item number 84.1.1.1, which is going to be, it's labeled sample from a magazine, so of a gun that was found in the Honda Cross tour. This is a mixture, isn't it?
This was a single source profile.
Okay.
It was a low level profile. Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, and LaPortia Polly were all included as being a potential contributor to that sample with a statistical weight of 50 and 100.
Okay. Again, not as strong to statistics, correct?
No.
All right. That closes out your first report.
Yes.
Right? That was the longest report, wasn't it? I think there's another one that's close to it.
Close.
All right. So moving on now to I'm going to do State's Exhibit number 566. Can you give me that packet? So I'm going to refer to, it's dated August 8th, filed September 4th.
Yes.
The next report. All right, so we're going to start, again, we have an inventory of the items, right?
Yes.
More inventory. But the important thing for us to get to is this Appendix 2, right?
Yes.
All right, so follow with me over to page 19 of 23. So this entire page is green, referring to Keast. The very first one that we have, it's labeled stained from pajama pants. And what we're, actually, so the first two I'm going to refer to because they're both stains from the pajama pants. What was the conclusion on that?
They were both single source profiles that matched the profile of Shavon Randle with that statistical weight of less than 1 in 10 trillion.
All right. And then the same as we go here to number 39, so stain or sample from, stain from the left sandal. What was the result from that?
Yes, that was a single source profile that matched the DNA profile of Shavon Randle with that same statistical weight of less than 1 in 10 trillion.
And just so that we remember, 1 in 10 trillion is a lot, right?
Yes, you would need roughly the population of 1,000 Earths, and you would expect to find that profile one time.
All right. Now, as we move down on this report, just the ones that have evidentiary value. So right here at 40, what is 40 identified to be?
40 was a stain from a necktie.
Okay. And what are our conclusions here?
On that first sample, it was a mixture of 2 individuals that I could determine to be a major contributor and a minor contribution. The DNA profile of the major contributor matched the DNA profile of Laquan Wilkerson with a statistical weight of the less than 1 in 10 trillion. And Shavon Randle was included as being a contributor to that minor contribution with a statistical weight of 1 in 5.76 billion.
So both Shavon and Laquan have high statistics of DNA on the necktie found at Keast. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, moving down, we have a towel and then a projectile. So that's y'all's clinical term for firearms evidence, right?
That's correct.
And what are our numbers here?
For that
Start with the towel.
first sample, there's 2 samples taken from the towel.
Okay.
For the first sample taken from the towel, it was a single source profile that matched the DNA profile of Shavon Randle with a statistical weight of 1 in 623 million. That second sample
Also still from the towel, right?
Yes.
So sometimes if Audrey saw different spots, the serologist, she would take multiple samples from one item, right?
Yes, she could either be taking multiple stains from the items. There's also, if there were stains from an item and then they were also wanting to see who handled the item, that would be another reason for multiple samples.
So like the necktie, even though it's one necktie, we have 4 different stains from that necktie, right?
That's correct.
And specifically in that necktie, it came bound. Audrey was able to untie it using utensils, not her own hands, to then take 4 separate stains, right?
Yes, I believe that's what she did.
All right, and then, so you were about to tell us the second stain from the towel. What were the results in that?
That sample was a single source profile that matched the DNA profile of Shavon Randle with that statistic of the less than 1 in 10 trillion.
All right. And then the final finding on this projectile, what was our number there and who did it come to?
It was another single source profile that matched the DNA profile of Shavon Randle with that same statistic of the less than 1 in 10 trillion.
All right. Now, going over to the black Lexus, right? So now we're in a different cluster based off all the identifiers. The very first one, which is a sample from a shirt, what do we have that's important here?
That sample was a single source profile that matched the DNA profile of Laquan Wilkerson with the statistical weight of the less than 1 in 10 trillion.
All right, and then I'm going to jump down to the other ones that have the larger numbers because those really are the ones that have values. So it's marked that there's a swab in 47.2 and then 47.3. In regards to Laquan Wilkerson, what did it look like statistically?
For 47.211, it was a mixture of 2 individuals that could be determined to be a major and a minor contribution. And for the 47.211, Laquan Wilkerson was included as being a potential contributor to that major contribution with a statistical weight of the less than 1 in 10 trillion. For the 47.311, it was a mixture of 3 individuals, again, could be determined to a major and a minor. And again, Laquan Wilkerson was included as being that major contributor with a statistical weight of less than 1 in 10 trillion. And in that minor contribution, Shavon Randle, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus were included as being potential contributors with a statistical weight of 88 in 100.
All right, now moving down, we're going to go to these 3 lines that I just highlighted here, but they're the 3 that go to 47.7, 47.8, and 47.9. Are all of the parties included in these?
Yes.
And the statistics, how would you generally classify those statistics?
They are very low for that first one. You see 100 and 100. So basically, everybody is going to be potentially included as being a potential contributor to that sample. And then the other ones, again, 79 and 100. So for every 100 people, 79 would be included. And then finally, the 98 and 100 is 98 out of every 100 people would be included.
All right, moving to the next page. So page 21, focusing here on the second line. So 47.13. What is important in this DNA swab from the black Lexus?
This was a mixture of 2 individuals that could be determined to a major and a minor contribution. Laquan Wilkerson was included as being of that major contribution with a less than 1 in 10 trillion stat.
Right. And then the next one that I want to draw our attention to is down here in 48.1-1 or .1.1. So again, swabs from the black Lexus. Who do we have a large number on?
It was a single source profile with 1 additional genetic marker that was seen. That single source profile matched the DNA profile of Laquan Wilkerson with that less than 1 in 10 trillion statistic. Shavon Randle, Desmond Jones, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus were included as being a potential contributor to that 1 additional genetic marker with a statistical weight of 79 in 100.
All right, moving on to the next page. There's a towel that also comes from the black Lexus, and that comes back to Laquan Wilkerson. Can you tell us the statistics on that?
It was that same less than 1 in 10 trillion.
All right, now we get back over to items from pieced. So items from where the bodies were. Focusing first on, really it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So these 9 rows, which are described as an Ethernet cord and black strap, and then a belt. What were the statistics? Who did these all come back to? Let me ask that first.
The only one that was included as being potential contributor to any of those samples was Shavon Randle. For the first 4 down from the Ethernet cord, it was a statistic of the less than 1 in 10 trillion. for the 62 1.3.2, it was an inclusion of 1 in 306 million. The next one, that first stain from the Ethernet cord and black strap, was a statistical weight of 1 in 5.69 million. The next one was an inclusion of that less than 1 in 10 trillion.
All right. And then down the bottom two, which are stains from plastic bags, those are also 1 in 10 trillion to be Shavon Randle's DNA on each of these items.
Yes, she was the only one included on those samples.
And do we know what biological material or evidence that was?
They were tested at least presumptively positive for blood.
Okay. When you have a blood sample, generally you will get pretty good numbers like this, right?
That's correct. Usually there's such a high concentration of DNA in blood that if there is a blood stain, you typically will get a very large, DNA profile.
And then moving on here, I'm going to skip these actually because the numbers are pretty general here for the last 3 items from Keast, okay?
Okay.
So that closes out that report. Here's one. So the next one is going to be dated September 10th, filed September 11th. You got it?
Yes.
Moving directly to Appendix 2. These are on the first page, all items from Keast again, right? So I want to focus on the first grouping. So 1, 2, skip a row, 3, 4, 5, 6. Do each of these come back to Shavon Randle?
Yes, Shavon Randle on those samples was the only one that was included as being a potential contributor.
Okay. And other than the 1 in 67,000, they're the really strong number of 1 in 10 trillion again, right?
Yes.
Now moving down then to the paper bag. So these 2 columns that I'm highlighting right here. So 31.1.1.1 and then 0.2. These are 2 different samples from the same bag, right?
That's correct.
But we come back with 2 completely separate people on each of those samples.
That's correct. That first sample was a single source profile that matched the DNA profile of Shavon Randle with that less than 1 in 10 trillion stat. The second sample taken from that brown paper bag was a single source profile that matched the DNA profile of Michael Titus with that same less than 1 in 10 trillion stat.
And then we have really similar results down here at the very bottom on the last 2 columns in regards to this plastic bag, right?
That's correct.
Where we have her on one sample and him with a lower number on the other sample from the same item.
Yes, that's correct.
Moving back to the ones that I skipped, so the belt, tell us what the conclusion was on those 3 stains.
So those were all single source profiles that matched the DNA profile of Shavon Randle, all of them with that same statistic of that less than 1 in 10 trillion.
And that was another one, just like the others, where it was presumptive for blood of Shavon Randle.
Yes, it tested at least presumptively positive for blood.
All right, now moving on to page 14 of your September 10th report. So the first thing that we're going to have is this fabric. Again, that's a 1 in 10 trillion number on Shavon, right?
That's correct.
And then we move down. I'm going to direct you over to the right sandal. Both of those samples, the first 2 samples or stains. Tell us about that statistic in the first one.
That sample was a single source profile that matched the profile of Shavon Randle. The statistical weight was 1 in 10.1 billion.
Okay, so the G stands for billion.
Yes.
All right, and then the next one is again that 1 in 10 trillion.
That's correct.
Moving down here, so we've got stain from handgun, and it comes back to 1 in 10 trillion for Michael Titus. Do you know where this handgun was?
From my notes, no.
Okay. Hypothetically, if there was a weapon near or under someone who'd been shot and bled out, would you expect to see their DNA, i.e. their blood, on that weapon?
Yes, that would not be surprising.
All right. Now, moving down, we've got, it's the purple, so from the Best Western. We've got a sample from a magazine. Tell me what this number means here at the bottom row.
The very last one?
Yep.
That was a mixture of 2 contributors, Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, LaPortia Polly, Darius Fields, and Michael Titus were all included as being potential contributors with a statistical weight of 81 in 100.
Again, that's not a great number, right?
That's correct. For every 100 people, you would expect 81 would also be included.
All right, now moving to your next report. So it's dated September 25th, but filed October 3rd of 2018. We're going to be talking about here evidence recovered from Keast, and then what I've generally labeled as all suspect property. Okay.
Okay.
So first, starting with Keast, we've got a piece of carpet that has multiple stains, or 2 pieces of carpet that have multiple stains that come back to Shavon, right?
Yes, for those first 3 samples, Shavon Randle was the only one that was included as being a potential contributor with that same 1 in 10 trillion stat.
All right, tell us about that 4th sample.
That sample was a mixture of 2 individuals. It could be determined to be the major contribution and the minor. Shavon Randle was included as that major contributor with that 1 in 10 trillion stat. Devontae Owens and Michael Titus were both included as being potential contributors to that minor contribution with the statistical weight of 1 in 6.
All right. Now moving down to the suspect property, none of this is really earth-shattering, right? So specifically on 70.6.9, we've got a tank top that is noted to be from Desmond Jones, and then we have his DNA, 1 in 10 trillion, on that tank top, right?
That's correct.
And then the same for a pair of underwear from Desmond Jones, right?
That's correct.
Laquan Wilkerson, we have a shoe from him here in the bottom row. That's kind of a low number, right?
That's correct.
Was this a mixture or a single source?
That was a mixture of 2 individuals.
Now moving on to the next page, so page 12 of your September 25th report. It's going to be his sock. Again, we have multiple people with low numbers, right?
Yes, that's correct. That first sample was a mixture of 4 individuals.
Okay, 4 individuals on 1 sock.
Yes.
Okay, and then we have a low statistical number, right?
Yes, the statistical weight for that inclusion was 91 in 100.
All right. But then when we get down to his right sock, we've got 1 in 10 trillion for Laquan, right?
That's correct.
And then there's an additional inclusion of possibly Devontae Owens for that right sock.
Yes, he was included in the minor contribution of that sample. It was a mixture of 3 individuals with a statistical weight of 1 in 274.
All right, and then the next thing that we have is going to be shorts of Laquan. It's 1 in 10 trillion coming back to him, Laquan, right?
Yes, he was the major contributor to that sample. He was included as the major contributor.
And then down here at the bottom, we have property that was recovered. So it's women's property that was recovered from the Best Western. That comes back on this first line, comes back with a strong number to LaPortia Polly, right?
Yes, that was a 3-person mixture, and she was included as the major contributor to that mixture with that less than 1 in 10 trillion stat.
All right. And then the next thing that we have is, so this is important because this is not a 1 in 10 trillion number, but it's not a 99 and 100 number, right? Here in this very top line, item number 83.
Yes, that was a mixture of 2 individuals, and Shavon Randle was being included as being a potential contributor with a statistical weight of 1 in 14,900.
And this is marked as a stain from a floor mat, right?
That's correct.
And then I have it orange because I've identified it as being from the black Lexus, right?
Yes.
All right. And then moving down, the one that I've just circled here, so the 1 in 10 trillion from Shavon Randle, what is this noted to be?
Those were stains from a right glove of Michael Titus.
All right. And tell me about the inclusion of Shavon Randle and then also the inclusion of Michael Titus on that glove.
On that first sample, it was a mixture of 2 individuals that could be a major and a minor contribution. Shavon Randle was being included as that major contributor with a statistical weight of the less than 1 in 10 trillion. Michael Titus was included as a contributor to the minor contribution with a statistical weight of 1 in 226,000.
So hypothetically, if I put on gloves and Tommy had been shot and I carry Tommy, so he's bleeding onto my gloves, and then I'm shot and I bleed out, would you potentially find both of our DNAs?
Yes, there's that potential.
And probably have pretty good statistics if it's blood from both of us.
Yes, that would be a good explanation.
All right, and then the left glove we only have as Michael Titus, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, moving forward to what we've introduced as States 569. This is going to be your report from October 17th, but filed on October 28th. All right. Is this the one that I was talking about earlier that you don't have right there?
I believe so.
Okay, why don't you let me show it to you and just look at it and we can kind of sort that out.
Okay.
So then let me go, it's going to be the November 8th, right?
Yes.
All right.
The November 1st.
I'm sorry, November 1st, filed November 6th, right?
Yes.
Only 3 pieces on this one, all from Keist because it's in green.
Yes.
So the very first thing that we have is a stain from a piece of fabric and then a stain from a piece of carpet. And how does that link up to Shavon Randle?
Those samples were all mixtures of 2 individuals. There was a single source profile and then there was 1 additional genetic marker. Shavon Randle matched that single source profile with that less than 1 in 10 trillion statistic.
All right, and then the sample from the handgun here in your last column, we have included for Laquan, Desmond, Darius, and Michael Titus with a 72 and 100. What does that mean?
They were all, and also what it says under there is it's YSTR. So, and also as with that first sample, it also says their inclusion with a YSTR. One of our areas that we look at on DNA is specific to males, and so it's only on the Y chromosome. And so for those samples, that additional genetic marker that I saw was at that 1 genetic marker that's specific to the Y chromosome. So for those statistics, it's a YSTR statistic for, and it would be 72 out of 100. So 72 out of 100 males would be included as being potential contributors to that 1 genetic marker.
Judge, may I approach the witness? Okay, can I just leave this with you? Okay, so there's 1 additional report. We separated it out because it refers to an unknown male.
That's correct.
All right, so I'm going to give you, let me take this copy. You can just have it. I know what it says. It's really not helpful, right?
Correct. There was 1 sample that was taken that we did analysis on that it was a single source profile that every person compared, Shavon Randle, Laquan Wilkerson, Desmond Jones, Devontae Owens, LaPortia Polly, Darius Fields, Michael Titus, they were all excluded. That profile was from a single unknown male, and his statistical weight for his inclusion was that same less than 1 in 10 trillion.
All right, so it's a strong number, but it's just an unknown person, right?
Yes.
And that was a DNA swab from the black Lexus.
That's correct.
Not from Keist or the white Ford or anything like that, right?
That's correct.
All right. I pass the witness room.
Hello.
Hello.
Let's go back to the white Ford. The first report you testified about, I think it's Exhibit 565. We can say beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Jones was in the white Ford at some point in time. Is that correct?
Looking at my report, I don't know what those samples would be without the color coding.
There's one where Mr. Jones is a major contributor to a mixture in the white Ford, and he's 1 in 10 trillion, so that's a match. Where in the white Ford was that DNA obtained from?
Can you tell me the item number?
No.
I don't. I would not know then. Where I do not know where items were obtained from my report without an item number.
Your report doesn't have item numbers?
My report has the item numbers, but it does not say where in the location it was collected from.
Let's just keep it simple then. We know that Mr. Jones was in the white Ford at some point in time.
He was
his biological material is in the Ford.
He was included from samples, yes, from a Ford.
Well, it's 1 in 10 trillion, so that's a match, right?
That is a very strong statistic, yes.
Well, you call that a match a few times today already, so he's in the white Ford, right?
I said the DNA profile matched the profile I obtained, and the statistic for that match was less than 1 in 10 trillion.
So beyond the number of planets in the solar system.
Yes, it's a very strong statistic.
So he was in the white Ford. All right. Now over on Keast, we know Michael Titus' biological material was in several places on Keast, right?
What report are you referring to? Yes, he was included as on multiple samples. I'm not sure what report you're.
Doesn't matter. He was there on Keast, and Miss Randle, her biological material was definitely over on Keast as well, right?
Yes, they were both included as contributors.
And the necktie over on Keast, we've got Wilkerson and Miss Randle definitely matched that, correct?
Yes, they were both included on that item.
If we would call that, okay. We have a shirt in the black Lexus that matches Wilkerson, is that right? According to my notes.
What were those items?
A shirt.
It's hard without you having my item number or the sample number and what report it's from to.
Okay. And there's a towel in that black Lexus that matched Mr. Wilkerson. Is that right?
Mr. Fishburne, are you asking your questions about what she's already testified about?
I'm just confirming that that's correct. Can you tell, or you don't have enough information?
She can't tell
Without
what report and what number.
All right. Well, we know that you don't have any DNA from Mr. Jones from anything you did over in the house on Keys. Would that be fair to say?
Again, I would need the report and all of the items from Keys to confirm.
And let's see. Would you just go ahead and look at your information that you have on Keys to check for me to see if you've got anything that matches the DNA of Mr. Jones? And that would be the last question that I have.
Okay.
How many reports do you have?
There's 6.
So she has to look through 6 reports.
My reports will not have the location. I'll have to go through my case files to try to figure out and match up the locations, unless if I can refer to the color-coded reports, if that's okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Judge, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Thank you.
You know what? If you have an objection to this witness doing this off the witness stand, and we can bring her back.
Oh, I have no objection to
Okay,
that.
this is gonna take a while.
And I have 2 additional witnesses today that are both relatively short. I would think maybe 15 minutes tops, so we could put her back on.
All right, would you mind doing that on
Nope.
the stand, and you understand what the question is?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm gonna call Dr. Glenn. I'm sorry, I'm gonna call Dr. Dyer first. Hi, good afternoon. Come on up.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this cause will be true?
I do.
Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. Can you tell us your name, who you work for, and what you do?
My name is Tracy Dyer, D-Y-E-R. I am a medical examiner with the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office.
As a medical examiner, what do you do?
Our primary responsibility is to determine cause and manner of death for people who die suddenly and unexpectedly. We do that for all of Dallas County and several surrounding jurisdictions as well.
What kind of educational training, professional training have you had that qualifies you in order to do that?
I have an undergraduate degree from a school in Kansas called Pittsburgh State. I actually have a law degree from the University of Kansas as well. I was a uniformed attorney for the Navy for several years. Then I decided to go to medical school, which I did in Oregon, at Oregon Health Sciences University. So I have a medical degree. I stayed on for a pathology residency program, which is 4 years of specialized training. And then I came here to Dallas for one final year of specialized training in forensics. I took a series of exams to be board certified in all those specialties, and I'm a licensed physician in the state of Texas.
Have you testified on few or many occasions as an assistant medical examiner?
Many.
All right. Really getting to why we're here today as we wrap up the end of the day. Did you perform an autopsy related to, it's going to be your lab number, IFS 1711865?
I did.
Do you have a copy of that there?
I do.
All right, and just so that we can verify that we're talking about the same one, I'm going to refer to what's already been introduced as State's Exhibit number 538. This is the autopsy of Michael Elijah Titus.
Yes.
Okay. Did you perform the autopsy of Michael Titus?
I did.
We're going to talk about how an autopsy works, so just what the steps are. But would it be fair for me to say that because this body was in a pretty substantial level of decomposition, the photographs are very gruesome?
They are.
So we will not be using them or referencing them, but we were able to do x-rays and a diagram, right?
Yes.
All right, so do you think that you can explain your autopsy, cause of death, manner of death, without having to look at those photos?
I can.
All right. When you start an autopsy, when you started this autopsy, what's the very first thing that you do?
The very first thing we do is we do a series of photographs documenting exactly how the individual is received at our facility. We then will do evidence collection. That could include taking gunshot residue analysis, head hair standard, blood standard, fingernail clippings, collecting clothing, anything that might be on the individual or in their pockets. We'll do a series of x-rays to look for any projectile material in the body.
Hold on, let me stop you there. When you say projectile material, that would be like a fired bullet or a bullet fragment or some sort of firearms evidence, right?
Yes.
Why do you do an x-ray?
Projectile material, bullets, bullet fragments will show up so that we can determine the location when we do the autopsy of where those are, because we'll always collect those if they're present.
Okay, and did you do that for your autopsy of Michael Titus?
Yes.
Specifically, I want to talk to you about the x-rays,
Okay.
because that was one of the first things that you did. Normally in your testimony, we would walk through the external photographs, right?
Yes.
But for this case, Your Honor, this time I would offer states 570 and 571, which are just the x-rays.
No objection.
So I'm going to show these first. So the first x-ray that we have here is number 570. What do we have over here on the side, these numbers?
So those are the numbers that correspond to our unique identifying number from the Institute of Forensic Sciences. Oftentimes we'll receive individuals, unfortunately they don't have a verified identification, which actually was the case here. When we received him, he was still unidentified at that point. So we always assign a unique identifying number so that we can track everything associated with the case.
And that's our number that we have here, which is 17-11865, right?
Yes.
And what is this? I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but what is this an x-ray of?
Yeah, it's an x-ray of his head and neck area.
And what, if any, projectiles did you observe in this x-ray?
There really was nothing to collect on this case. There was 2 gunshot wounds, which I'm sure we'll talk about. There's a tiny little fragment, that little white dot that you can see there, but it would have been just an infinitesimally small piece of lead, nothing that would have had any evidentiary value. The other thing you can see on this x-ray is actually there are multiple fractures of the skull. All of these, the solid areas are where there's no fractures. That's what your whole skull should appear like on an x-ray. So there's a large fracture at the top, and there's multiple fractures on both sides as well.
I'm looking here at State's Exhibit number 571. Can you describe what this is for us?
And this was a radiograph of what we would call the trunk, which is the chest and abdomen area, includes the spine, and again, there's no projectile material.
So nothing that would tell you where you need to look for any evidence or projectiles when you start the actual autopsy?
Correct.
Did you also do the external examination of the body?
Yes.
And so now I'm going to put up your report because it's easier to follow along, but basically you describe the external examination, right?
Yes.
And I won't make us all read it along or hear you read it out loud because I know it's getting later in the day. But can you describe to us anything of note or injury that you observed from the external examination?
Yes. So we start with just, again, we'll skim over just the general clothing, characteristics, all of that. And there was a lot of decompositional change that got described as well. When you get to the evidence of injury section, the 2 important findings here was that Mr. Titus had 2 gunshot wounds of the head, 2 distinct gunshot wounds of the head. So 4 total defects.
And were you able to tell where those gunshot wounds were?
Yes.
All right. And so do you think that it would help if I flip over to the back? We have a drawing, right?
Sure.
Now, specifically looking here at the very last page on State's Exhibit number 538, is this just a diagram of a head?
Yes.
And talk to us about the gunshot wounds, how you were able to determine that they were gunshot wounds.
So there were defects in the scalp and underlying defects in the skull, all very consistent with gunshot wounds. They had an aspect of what we call beveling, which is chipping away of the bone in a certain pattern from a gunshot wound. So we could look at the one that's described as number 1, where the entrance is on the right temporal scalp, and you could see that that was in fact an entrance wound. So it was, as you can see on the diagram, just slightly above and in front of the right ear. The bullet for that wound went through the scalp, it went through the skull, it went through the brain, and then exited on that X that's directly above the left ear.
How can you tell the difference between an entrance wound and an exit wound to mark them so clearly?
There are several ways that we look. Some of them weren't available in this case because of the decomposition, but in this case I'm quite certain about it because of this beveling aspect, this chipping of the bone that you can only see from looking at the skull surface itself from the outside and the inside, and this had the characteristics on the right temple of being an entrance wound.
So even though it's at the bottom of our picture, we have the circle denotes an entrance and then the X always denotes an exit, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Now moving over here to gunshot wound number 2, talk to us about this.
This one was a much more tangential wound.
What does that mean when you say that?
Tangential, as in it didn't go directly through like the other one. It was sort of at an odd angle. So the entrance wound is right here above the left eyebrow, and the bullet went through the scalp, it went through the frontal bone of the forehead, and then it basically just came out. It went through the frontal lobe of the brain, and then it came out on the superior aspect of that frontal area. So it was a very steep upward angle.
Now we're calling these gunshot wounds 1 and 2. Does that mean that they chronologically happened in that order?
It does not. They're numbered in the report just for report purposes.
So let me ask you this, kind of in a different way, but in the same vein. if Mr. Titus were to be shot with gunshot wound number 2 first, is this the type of wound that would make him drop to the ground or, be incapacitated?
Yes, it may not be immediately lethal, but it would certainly be an incapacitating wound because it did go through skull and the frontal lobe of the brain.
All right. And then gunshot wound number 1, the same question.
Yes, that wound would probably be immediately lethal.
When you say immediately lethal, are we talking about under a minute, seconds?
Yes.
And then is that because it literally goes through the brain?
Yes.
You can't tell us which one happened first, but what would make them, you can't tell us which one happened first. So after you do the external examination, do you then do internal examination?
Yes.
Talk to us about how that stage of your autopsy goes.
We'll open the major body cavities initially. Again, look for signs of injury or natural disease involving any of the internal organs. We then reflect the scalp. We look at the outside of the skull. We remove the skull. We look at the inside of the skull, the dura, and the brain parenchyma itself.
All right. And did you do that in this case?
Yes.
Did you observe, so we've talked about the head injuries. Was the internal examination consistent with what you noted on the outside?
Yes.
Were there any other internal injuries that you were able to observe?
No.
All right. Now the other thing that you mentioned at the very beginning when we looked at that x-ray is that there was a bunch of fractures. Talk to us about that.
So there were fractures of many of the bones involving the what we call the calivarium, which would be the main part of your skull, as well as the base of the skull, where the bones are, where your brain sits onto that base of the skull. So there were what we call linear fractures of several of these bones, which are just lines, and there were also what are called comminuted fractures, which is sort of a splintering effect that involve the bones of the base of the skull.
And I'm sorry, what could cause that?
That's very common in gunshot wounds like this that go through the skull.
All right. So it wasn't as though like he had, I know you weren't there so you can't say definitively, but hypothetically, it wasn't as though he had had like a traumatic injury or blunt force trauma plus a gunshot wound. It could have just been the gunshot wound through the skull.
Yes, what I saw was consistent with injury from 2 gunshot wounds. I didn't see any evidence of additional blunt trauma.
All right, so one of the biggest questions that I've had in this case from the very beginning is we all know that there was a bunch of decomposition, right?
Yes.
And I'm sure that you've been told, but he was found in a house that was very hot with no air conditioning in the sun, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us when he had died?
I cannot.
Okay.
I cannot be very definitive about that. The level of decomposition in this case, well, in all cases, decomposition is far more variable in reality than it's depicted in television or movies. We live in Texas. This was July. It was inside an unair-conditioned home that was in a state of dilapidation. We don't know exactly what environmental impacts there could have been from sunlight, from heat retention in the house. So there's a whole variety of things that could have come into play. You don't know exactly where insects are going to appear first, or if they have a predilection for one area of the house over another. So there's all sorts of factors that are really hard to account for to try to pin down an exact date of death, other than to say it had not been in the last day or 2.
That's what I was about to ask. So can we say, though, it wasn't within like 6 hours?
Definitely.
12 hours?
Definitely.
24 hours?
Yes.
Probably getting close to 48 hours. So it would have been more than 24, 36, 48 hours. Is that fair?
I think at that point, once you get out to about that level, it's possible, but it's definitely not any closer to that.
All right. The last kind of hypothetical and thing I wanted to talk to you about is, let me ask you this definitively, kind of your conclusion. What was the cause and manner of death in this case?
The cause of death was gunshot wounds of the head.
All right, and manner?
And the manner's homicide.
All right. How do we know it wasn't a suicide?
There are rare occasions where people can succeed in firing a gun twice, and it can be a suicide. I have seen those. I've called those cases suicide on occasion.
How could you not? How are you definitively able to say this is a homicide and not a suicide with 2 gunshot wounds?
Right. to this, in this particular case, in my opinion, it's not possible because the damage to each individual wound was too significant to have been able to fire another subsequent shot.
Okay. Pass the witness.
I have no questions.
Thank you, doctor.
State calls Dr. Gwynn. Thank you. Hi, going up.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You solemnly-
I know.
You do solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this cause will be the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
I feel the same way, Judge. I think we all do at this point, except for Dr. Gwynn. Can you tell us your name, who you work for, and what you do first?
Yes. Good afternoon. I'm Chester Gwynn, GWIN.
Who do you work for?
I'm a medical examiner with Dallas County Medical Examiners Department, also known as the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences.
You literally passed Dr. Dyer, so you guys have the same job, right?
Correct.
Is it fair for me to just jump in and say that you have the same educational and professional qualifications, right?
As it pertains to medical examiner, yes.
Maybe not the same school, maybe not Pittsburgh and Kansas,
Well,
but.
she's also a lawyer. I am not. So.
Okay. You've testified on many occasions as an assistant medical examiner, right?
I have.
As to cause and manner of death, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to, Judge, may I approach?
You may.
I'm going to show you what we've already introduced into evidence, everything. So State's Exhibit number 539. This is a copy of your report for case number IFS 1711864 for decedent Shavon Randle, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so it's a 9-page report, and then there's a diagram at the back of it for us, right?
That's correct.
And then here states 540, 541, and 542 are going to be x-rays that were taken during your autopsy, right?
Correct.
And then states what I've marked as 543, 544, and 545 are pictures of evidence recovered during the autopsy. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. I'm going to step back with these. You have a copy of the report?
I do.
All right. Were you asked to do or assigned to do an autopsy on Shavon Randle?
I was.
And that was in the summer of 2017, right?
Correct.
Her body, as well as the body of a male, which is the autopsy Dr. Dyer did, they came in around the same time, right?
I believe so.
They both had been decomposing in a vacant home, correct?
That's correct.
So is it okay for me to not introduce the photographs and us just refer to the diagram and the x-rays to explain your autopsy here today?
Sure.
All right. Sometimes we need the photos to explain things, but this one, it's gunshot wound, right?
That's correct.
And so the x-ray will show us, and then the diagram shows us as well, right?
Correct.
All right. So do you do an autopsy like Dr. Dyer, and then you start with an external examination?
Yes.
All right. And what else do you do next?
As part of that external examination, there'd be photographs taken, evidence taken, documentation of just general body habitus and any injuries of the body. Once that is completed, we'll proceed to the internal examination, which is we're examining the chest organs, the abdominal organs, and the brain.
All right. So talk to me first about the external examination. What evidence of injury did you observe when you did the external?
There were numerous gunshot wounds of the body.
All right. Do you think it would be helpful, instead of us reading through the paragraphs, if we just go straight to the diagram and talk about the gunshot wounds?
Sure.
Okay. So you said numerous. How many total gunshot wounds did we have?
4 gunshot wounds.
All right. And do you have them identified here on this last page of your autopsy?
I do.
Can you walk us through it? Let's start from, so you go from head to toe numbering them, right?
Correct. It's an arbitrary numbering of the body, of the gunshot wounds, and I typically go from head down.
All right, so let's start up at the top of the head with GSW, so gunshot wound number 1. Tell us about this.
That gunshot wound number 1 is the entrance wound is on the right frontotemporal scalp.
Where was the exit for this gunshot wound?
The exit for that is going to be on the left side of the neck, just behind the left ear.
How were you able to tell for this gunshot wound? And really the same question for number 2 and number 3, the difference between the entrance and the exit.
Entrance wounds are typically round to oval, whereas exit wounds are more slit-like and irregular. The wound edges will typically reapproximate.
And as part of your examination, you took close-ups of those photos, but again, these are pretty graphic photos, right?
Yes.
So we can trust you when you say that you were able to identify the entrance versus the exit.
Thank you.
All right. So number 2, talk to us about the entrance and exit for gunshot wound number 2.
Gunshot wound number 2 entrance is on the right cheek, and then the exit for gunshot wound number 2 is on the left cheek.
All right. Moving down to gunshot wound number 3, tell me about this.
3 was a perforating injury of the left breast. So the entrance wound, bless you, was on the proximal aspect of the left breast towards the head, and then the exit wound was on the undersurface of the left breast.
Talk to me a little bit about the trajectory, right? Because normally we see like an entrance and then an exit, or an entrance and then an exit, but an entrance and then an exit?
Correct. It was basically going straight down.
All right. Through her chest.
It didn't enter into the chest cavity. It only went through the breast tissue.
All right. And then gunshot wound number 4, what do we have?
Number 4 entrance is on the proximal left aspect of the abdomen.
Did you also do x-rays as part of the external examination, kind of the preliminary on this case?
Yes.
Looking here at states number 540, and this is an x-ray of the head, right?
That's correct.
Tell us what it is that's of note or important in this picture.
So if you turn the x-ray, can you flip it over?
Like this?
No, flip it.
No, because it's a picture.
It is? Oh,
Sorry.
okay, gotcha.
So you get that on the other side.
Yeah, that wouldn't help. Okay.
All right.
So we're looking at this kind of backwards. Let me make sure I'm describing this correctly.
So you've got that screen right there to your left?
Yes. So as we're looking at this, the right side of the body is on our right side. So it's typically reversed based on how we typically look at it at autopsy examination.
Okay.
But what we do see here are several fragments of projectile that are along gunshot wound number 1 and number 2 pathways.
So since we have it flip-flop, over in the dark area, because it's lime green, will you mark an R and an L? So I have no bearing about what you said. Okay. And then I'm gonna flip it to maybe the red, I guess. Can you circle those projectiles that you talked about? You made little dots, but you can't see it. So will you circle where those metal fragments were?
Yes. So metal fragments are here, here, and here. Those are the bigger ones, but obviously there's several more along those pathways.
And you said that those were the pathways of what gunshot wounds?
Of 1 and 2.
All right. So if we go back over to our report, we get off. So it would be these headshots, right?
Yes.
Consistent with our fragments here on states 540.
Yes.
Now looking at states 542, is this just an x-ray of like the chest cavity?
It is, yeah, the chest and abdomen.
Was there anything of note in this x-ray, or are there no projectiles or metal fragments?
Correct, there's no metal fragments of projectile.
Moving to 541 though, we have very obviously one, right?
Yes, this is the right side and the left side here, and there's a projectile that was found within the right hip joint space.
And that would be consistent with which of the gunshot wounds?
That projectile was associated with gunshot wound number 4 of the abdomen.
Why does that, well, actually, why don't we just go ahead and show? So when you recover, do you actually recover those projectiles or fragments?
Yes.
And they're tagged into evidence for court purposes, right?
Correct.
And then, but we also take pictures so we don't have to dig through it, right?
That's correct.
So looking here, it states 543. Where was this projectile found?
That was the projectile recovered from the right hip space.
All right. And you can see, if you put it like that it was in her right hip, right?
That's correct.
This is, would it be fair for me to say this is a more complete, right? Like it's not been fragmented.
Right. It's a pretty intact, non-deformed bullet.
Intact. Looking here at states 544, where were these fragments from?
These fragments were recovered from the left side of the brain. And again, they're just fragments. We can see a fragment of jacket. That's the one on our right side, kind of the more yellow metal, and then a fragment of the core, which is next to it.
So you said that this was the jacket, right?
That's correct.
And then over on the left, the darker part was the core, right?
Yes.
Okay. Moving here over to states 545, what are we looking at?
This is a projectile fragment that was recovered from the right cheek. That was going to be associated with gunshot wound number 2.
And both states 545 and 544 were obvious in that x-ray of Shavon Randle's skull, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so getting off of the x-rays, did you then do an internal examination?
Yes.
And part of that is recovering the projectiles or fragments, right?
Right.
And was there any other evidence of injury internally that you saw in the examination that was of note?
Obviously, with gunshot wound number 1 of the head, there were brain injuries. The projectile went through the left and right sides of the brain. As it pertains to gunshot wound number 2, that was the one that entered the right cheek. There were fractures of the mandible, which is the upper part of the mouth, and also numerous teeth. Gunshot wound number 3 just went through soft tissue, and gunshot wound number 4 and went through soft tissues and fractured the right side of the pelvis.
Starting with gunshot wound number 1, would that have been, so that's the one that goes through kind of the top of her head and then out the back of her head. What type of injury is that? Like how quickly would that be incapacitating or debilitating?
That's a rapidly fatal wound.
Same question for gunshot wound number 2, which went through the mouth.
It's a potentially lethal wound because it may have only hit the maxilla and the teeth, bless you, but there is something we call a temporary cavity. It's basically the shock wave that expands out past that bullet, and it's in an area that may have affected the brainstem, so it could have been also
Gunshot wound number 3 is a very different type of gunshot wound, right? I mean, it went through fatty breast tissue.
Correct.
So talk to me about the lethality of that.
I would have expected, if it was just that wound, I would have expected Shavon to survive that wound.
Gunshot wound number 4, which is the one that went into her abdomen and then settled down there in her right hip. How would that work?
Yes, it went through soft tissues and fractured the pelvis, so she wouldn't have been able to walk with that type of wound, and there would have been some internal bleeding from that.
And just to clarify, although we're calling them 1, 2, 3, and 4, it doesn't mean that they happened in this order, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Are you able to tell when it was that Shavon Randle was killed?
No.
Why not?
Mainly because she was in a residence that was, didn't have AC, and it was in the summertime, so there was decomposition involved.
And unlike TV, we can't actually look at decomp and then give a specific hour or date that someone was killed, right?
We can't be specific with it. We can give a range of time, generally speaking, based on when the person was last known alive, when that person was found, And then based on our findings, we could say that's consistent with.
Okay, so if I gave you hypothetically that she was seen on a Wednesday morning and that the body was recovered late on Saturday, would that be consistent with this level of decomp?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. Could be, right?
Right.
Could you tell us that it did not happen just 6 hours prior to recovery of the body?
I don't think it happened that soon.
Okay. If I take it out to 12 or 24 hours, are you comfortable saying that?
It's possible only because, you know, she's in an unair-conditioned house, and it is summertime in Texas, so decomposition would be more rapid.
Right. Yeah. So I want to, before I get to your conclusion, so a firearm, are you familiar with the Texas definition of a deadly weapon?
Yes.
Firearm is per se by state law a deadly weapon, right?
Yes.
Because in its manner of use or intended use, it is capable of causing serious bodily injury or death, right?
It can, yes.
And in fact, in your job, you're talking about cases where it has caused death, right?
Yes, we see that a lot.
And in this case, right?
Correct.
And your manner of death conclusion in this case was?
Homicide.
And your cause of death in this case was?
Gunshot wounds of the head and torso.
Pass the witness.
I have no questions.
Thank you, doctor. You may stand down. You're free to leave.
Thank you.
Judge, if I may just go check with Ms. Ferreira to see if she's got that answer.
I'd like the record reflect Courtney Ferreira as we're taking a stand. She's on the road.
May I proceed?
You may.
Thank you for looking through all of that. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Did you find Mr. Jones' DNA on any of the material you tested that came from the house on Keys?
He was included in 5 samples with very low statistics. There was a sample from a belt that he was included in a mixture with a 92 and 100 statistic. There was a sample from a shirt that he was included with a 99 and 100 statistic. There was a sample from a right sandal that he was included with a 100 and 100 statistic. And then on the last report, there were 2 samples from fabric and handgun, and he was included on those YSTR statistics with a 72 and 100 statistic.
If you have a DNA standard for me, I would likely be, quote, included in a 98 out of 100 probability, isn't that right?
It would be a good likelihood, yes.
As a matter of fact, anything over 51 out of 100, it's more likely than not that I would have been included as well. Is that correct?
Yes, for every, in a 98 and 100, 98 people will be included out of 100.
So when you say 100 out of 100, everyone in this room would be included, is that right?
There'd be the potential that, yes, everyone would be included.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I have no further questions.
Thank you. All right, members of the jury, we are in recess for the day. We will see you in the morning at 8:45. Please remember your admonishments.
All rise.
Okay, thank you. You've got your box still?
It's, yeah, no, I got it. It's on there. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
I'm Tanya Eiserer, investigative reporter here at Channel 8, joined by Meredith Behgooy.
Behgooy.
Behgooy. It is what it is. I can't get names straight. So this last witness that we had, this last brief thing where they brought the DNA person back up, and was this a pretty good save on the part of the defense? Basically?
I thought so, yeah, because it sounded like Courtney was going to say none of that stuff in the house had any of Jones's DNA on it, and so when she came out, she was like, "Oh yeah, I got 5 different things that have his DNA on it. They are a low probability." That wasn't looking.
But my
too
DNA
good.
could be on that, right?
Yeah,
your DNA.
Yeah,
so
right.
it's so that's what
I
he's
could have been in the house. You could have been in the house.
So
all of us in the room could have been in the house.
So that's a pretty good. If you're the defense, that's a pretty good. You're basically saying there's no DNA
definitively putting him there.
Putting him there, which
Right.
is pretty good stuff. I mean, that's it, from the defense's perspective. That's helpful.
Definitely.
Because it seems like everybody else's DNA is in that house.
It does seem
and
like that,
like
yes.
by large. I don't remember what the quantities were, but it seems like everybody else, it's like a pretty good high
trillions and
likelihood,
billions.
trillions and billions and all that kind of stuff. So let's talk about, though, before we go back fully to the DNA, about this last testimony we heard. So for the first time, we're getting a sense of the injuries. We heard from Tracy Dyer talking about Michael Titus's autopsy. He was shot twice in the head. And very importantly, the prosecutor asked, well, could he have killed himself via suicide?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which is key because the gun is found in his hand.
Right.
So as a prosecutor, what are you trying to do there?
Well, you're definitely trying to close off any avenues that the defense may have to argue in closing, because once you're closing, the state can go first and last, so they can respond to defense arguments. But you definitely don't want the defense to be able to place doubt in the minds of that jury by saying it could have been a suicide.
Right.
As ridiculous as it sounds, you
want to make it clear.
things.
Look, these gunshot wounds, neither of these are survivable.
Right.
There's no way that he's able to do either one of these and then do the second one.
Right. Kill her and then kill himself, and we're all just innocently here.
Let's see. Hold on. Somebody's posting. I don't know. So somebody says, I could have sworn I seen the Wilkerson person come in the courtroom in the very beginning. Must be talking about Laquan. I don't think I've seen Laquan at all. No. He's
It would be unusual.
Yeah, I don't think so. But he's in jail right now.
Oh, okay.
So and then also we're now finding out where Shavon Randle was shot. She was shot 4 times. That's the first time we know exactly how many times. Once in the head, which was not a survivable wound. Then in the cheek, and then the left breast, and in the 4th time in the stomach. And the medical examiner testified that the one in the head and the one in the stomach, that those were the wounds that would have killed her.
Those were potentially fatal. And he also said the cheek wound was potentially fatal as well because of that cavity that he was talking about, and the brainstem being so close. You certainly don't want a bullet anywhere near, a high velocity bullet anywhere near your brainstem. So really 1, 2, and 4 were lethal. He said 3 would have been survivable. The left breast was a surface kind of a wound, but certainly a brutal execution of a 13-year-old baby girl.
It's and we were talking about this while this testimony was going on. It's infuriating because it's not like, I don't know exactly how I thought she was killed, but I didn't realize she was shot 4 times.
Right.
Not that makes it any better
No.
or worse. It makes it worse. It makes it worse because it's like, this is you're trying to make sure this kid is dead.
She does not survive, right? And to survive to testify to what? Aggravated kidnapping? Like you wanted to commit a murder to cover up an aggravated kidnapping. It doesn't really make much sense, and I don't think anybody can explain that, right?
There are no good reasons for this. Well, Stoic 24 is saying that he saw Laquan Wilkerson in the courtroom this morning. I must not have seen that. Says he's speculating that maybe he pled the 5th. Could they have brought Laquan Wilkerson in to plead the 5th? Would there have been a reason to bring him in the courtroom? I do remember that early on there was a couple of how the judge will frequently have people that they're they're sometimes got little set in bond and that kind of thing.
Oh, sure, little housekeeping matters.
Housekeeping stuff.
Yes.
Is it possible they would have brought him in to do that?
They could have brought him in to do something related to his case. but it's highly unusual to bring in a co-defendant to another co-defendant's trial. And, you know, the state, if he's on the state's witness list, they could call him, but he would definitely have a deal in place or something. There's no way he's getting up there to testify.
I think the
without a
likelihood
deal
that they would cut a deal with Laquan
is
Wilkerson
slim to none. Yeah,
exactly. What do you think about some of what we heard about this DNA, where it was found? I thought we got. How strong is the case now for these other defendants? Against these other defendants, Laquan Wilkerson, Darius Fields, and Devontae Owens.
Right. I didn't get a good sense of, we had it, and I liked how Jen put it into different vehicles. So we had the Cross Tour, we had the white Ford, we had the black Lexus, and we had the house, the residence. But we didn't really get a sense of who. We could have also broken it down by person and said, Devontae is here, and Randle is here, and Titus is here.
And it's rolling by so fast, it's hard to really keep up.
And that was hard to keep up with because the mixtures and the numbers, and it's after lunch, and it's hard to follow. So I don't know how strong. I mean, it looks like LaShawn Wilkerson is the one on the necktie with Shavon Randle. So of all the people, I thought that was the most striking.
Yeah, I
is
circled
that.
He
has a mixture where he is a contributor with her on a necktie.
Well, and Laquan Wilkerson, whose nickname is Chuck, and he is the one that Desmond Jones in one of his statements or multiple statements said that he killed Michael Titus. He claims that's who. So yeah, and then the other thing I circled that, and then there was one other thing. The Ethernet cord and the black strip. Well, they had mentioned earlier that she had been tied up with like telephone wire, so I'm guessing that's what it was. But it's just hard to hear.
The whole picture that's emerging is disturbing.
Well, there is. I tend to think there's such a thing as evil, and this is evil. There's really no getting around it.
I'm not going to argue with you on that.
No. So let's. What do you think the upshot is of all the testimony we've heard today?
I think that the state's done a great job of putting all of the pieces together. They put all those pieces out there for the jury. In closing, they can assemble that puzzle for them. They'll show them the evidence, they'll show them the pictures, they'll explain it all and put it all together in a package that makes sense. It definitely sounds like it's when you dump that puzzle out on the table and you can kind of see all the pieces are here. I got my puzzle, it's there. It just needs a little shaping, a little massaging, and then to just be
put it in a bow tie for folks.
Put it in a bow tie.
Because I'm still a little bit unclear on some stuff. Like I'd like that ballistic evidence put into English for me.
Right. I want to know which item, the bullet in the right hip, I want to know which item, when the firearms expert was testifying, which one that was. So there's some loose ends that need to be tied, but sometimes, with timing of witnesses, like I said, witnesses have their own schedules too, and lives, and sometimes we don't get them on in the order that we'd like, in the ideal order, but I don't doubt that they will tie that up for the jury in closing arguments.
Are they done?
It sounds like it, yes.
You end with the ME?
ME.
Is that always how you end?
Unless they want to recall the detective to come back up there, but he's their lead detective.
Mostly we heard from the FBI.
We did.
We
so
really
they
didn't.
Could get
there was a
Lancaster detective in there.
Yeah, I don't think we ever really. I'm thinking out in my head. I mean, we've heard from some Lancaster patrol officers, but I don't believe we ever heard from a Lancaster.
I didn't know if they turned over the investigation to the FBI completely, or if they had a homicide detective from Lancaster.
There was a homicide detective, and I forget his name. I've slept too many times since they said who he was. And so I don't know if they'll put him on. Maybe they'll have him tie this up in a bow, or maybe they're done. Maybe they'll do it in closing.
They could definitely rest on this,
So if this was you, would you rest?
Yeah. Oh yeah. You end with, a brutal killing of a 13-year-old, and that's the last image that the jury's going to have. And then what is the defense going to do? Are they going to call Desmond Jones? If they do, then they're running the risk of him possibly testifying contrary to what he told the police, and now he's a liar or unreliable, or do they just rest right after the state, close, and try to shoot holes in circumstantial cases are always easy to shoot holes in because it's circumstantial. No one saw anything.
But he gave a lot of statements. Well, I had a few people that were asking questions, and I was trying to go back and answer them. So somebody asked, will all the statements that Jones made come back to haunt him? It seems like they already have.
Yes, it sounds like they already have.
I mean, because originally, according to the testimony, they were treating him as a cooperating witness, and then when he gives this sixth statement, he goes from a cooperating witness to being charged with kidnapping.
Always are very skeptical of cooperating witnesses. You have to know that. Like, you know that he thought he was helping, but they were just looking like.
Well, they're waiting for him to say something.
Everyone's a witness until they're a suspect.
Right, exactly. When I was listening to them talk about, oh yeah, we're going to give you this phone and this and that and the other, and I'm thinking to myself, yeah, right. Yeah, they're really going to let you out. But you know, they acted like that was really what they were planning to do, so I don't know if they were or they weren't.
They can be very convincing sometimes. And maybe they were until they decided you know way too much about this murder to just be a witness.
And somebody else says, my head is spinning, you know, and basically questioning, like, how does a jury take all this stuff we heard today?
I know, and it's kind of like we complain no matter what, because we complain when we don't have any DNA and we don't have fancy CSI stuff, but then when we do have it, we're like, oh God, numbers, you know, stop telling me all these numbers. So we complain either way, I'd say, because it's too much of a good thing. We have too much science and technology, and that's what we're running into. Is it's hard to put that into basic, simple terms. It is high level DNA, whatever testing.
Queen Pudding didn't like my saying tie it up with a bow. I don't know how else to say it, but that's kind of what you do. I mean, I get what you're saying, yeah, but
too close to the fact.
Certainly, it wasn't any inference on Shavon, but obviously, typically prosecutors do end up with the ME, and then they're going to come in closing, and let me say it a better way. They're going to put the puzzle together for everybody, right? They're going to take these puzzle pieces that they've laid out, and they're going to put the puzzle together for the jury so they can make their decision. But you know, if you were ballparking it and giving odds, do they put on anything? Because they haven't said much.
Right. Well, they don't have to. I mean, they can literally do nothing. He can rest on his presumption of innocence, and he's innocent up until and unless the state proves him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, this jury charge is going to be lengthy and complicated because of the nature of that statute, and you've seen how long the indictment is. Now, that jury charge is going to be a good 20 pages.
Oh, wow.
And so the jury's going to have to go back there and read the whole thing over again and decide for themselves each count of murder, aggravated kidnapping. Did the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he is culpable, you know, to the level of being found guilty? So I think it is going to be difficult for the jury in that sense. But so they don't necessarily have to put on anything, and obviously we don't get to know what the defense has because they don't have to show anything to the state or anything like that.
Right,
so,
they're still innocent until proven guilty.
I mean, we could have a surprise witness for all we know.
It's possible. It's possible. Says Demario Weathers wanted to know, with the trial and more to come, will we ever know who killed Shavon?
We may never know.
I think that's likely unless somebody decides to confess.
Right, and that's one of the hardest things about criminal cases is that there's, you know, when multiple people commit crimes, you don't know who to believe, even if someone came forward and said, I did it.
Well, it's not like any of these people are particularly good people.
Right, and it's not like they're trustworthy, right? So, you know, you may never ever get that closure, and that's something that's very difficult for the families I've seen over and over, is that it's so hard to get closure from a criminal case like this because it just hurts the family all over again. It brings up old memories and traumas, and they don't actually get a sense of justice sometimes, I want to say, because it just hurts.
Well, because nothing ever brings your child back.
No.
I mean,
putting somebody in prison for the rest of their life is not going to bring your child back, that's for sure.
No, it isn't. Well, Meredith, thank you so much for joining us today.
So much for
we
having
appreciate
me.
the folks out there that have been with us. We'll be back tomorrow, and starting bright and early. Meredith will not be back.
No, I have to go back to work.
Do you know who our guest is tomorrow? I'm not sure who it is, guys, but I'm sure it'll be somebody really good. It might be Justin Moore, but my memory is not very good. But we'll be back tomorrow between 8:45 and 9. We'll see if the prosecution rests, and if the defense decides to do something, we may go straight to closing statements. Although would they have normally said to prepare them, or do you think they're preparing them now?
I think they're already prepared as far as closing arguments. I mean, I'm sure they know. If the state was going to rest, I'm sure the defense knows that.
Okay. Well, anyway, thank you so much for joining us out there, and thanks again, Meredith, for being here with me. And today it's a pleasure. It's a slog, and I know we had a little bit of technical difficulties earlier. Oh, okay. One more question. So I know that I make my folks mad over there who every time I'm about to cut the sound, I start answering questions again. Folks want to know, will you do live coverage on the trial for the co-defendants? I would love to. It all depends on what's going on at that moment in time, because as you can imagine, none of my other work actually goes away. But I do love doing this, so if at all possible, we will definitely do the other trials. I already thanked Meredith. Sorry, Tasha.
She thanked me.
Some of you folks may remember
Thank you for
Tasha.
thanking
She's over
me.
there. Tasha's over there signaling me, telling me to thank Meredith because I have rudeness problems. But anyway, again, I appreciate you guys, and we'll be back tomorrow. Thank you.